Picture, if you will, the cathedral quiet computer labs of 1970s universities. Terminals glowing green in the darkness, connected to mainframes that filled entire rooms. And there, hunched over keyboards, students transformed routine assignments into the creation of digital worlds. The Plato system at the University of Illinois became an unlikely incubator for the role-playing game revolution. Not through corporate mandate or market research, but through pure creative compulsion. These weren't games in any commercial sense. They were experiments in digital possibility. Take Pedit 5, created in 1975 by Rusty Rutherford, a population and health statistics student who should have been analyzing demographic data. Instead, he coded the first known computer dungeon crawler during off hours, naming it after the program slot it occupied. Program Edit number 5. The university deleted it repeatedly, considering it frivolous waste of valuable computing resources. Yet students kept recreating it, passing code hand to hand like samizdat literature. What drove this compulsion? These pioneers were translating the communal storytelling of Dungeons & Dragons, barely a year old itself, into solitary digital experiences. But something alchemical happened in that translation. The computer couldn't improvise like a dungeon master, couldn't adapt to player creativity. So developers had to anticipate every possibility, encode every interaction. In doing so, they built entire worlds out of if-then statements, philosophy rendered in Fortran.
Plato offered 8K words of memory per program, roughly 32 kilobytes. Every room, every monster carefully budgeted.
And within those constraints, magic. Consider D&D, yes, they named it that boldly, created on Plato in 1975. Its developers, Gary Weisenhunt and Ray Wood, managed to squeeze in multiple dungeon levels, dozens of monster types, and even a primitive economy where players could buy equipment between expeditions. They accomplished this through elegant data compression. Monsters weren't unique entities, but statistical templates. Orc, level 2, hit points 8. The dungeon itself existed as coordinate matrices, each room a collection of flags, north door, south door, treasure present, monster type. But here's what captivates me. These games were becoming something their creators never intended. Multiplayer functionality emerged not from design documents, but from Plato's architecture. Multiple terminals accessing the same mainframe meant multiple players could inhabit the same digital space. Suddenly, Oubliette introduced party-based exploration in 1977. 4 players could band together, seeing each other's statistics on screen, coordinating attacks against digital dragons. The social contract of tabletop gaming, trust, cooperation, shared narrative, translated into code. The aesthetics were primitive by necessity. Wireframe dungeons, ASCII characters representing heroes and monsters, yet players would spend dozens of hours navigating these abstract mazes. They drew their own maps on graph paper, maintaining physical artifacts of digital journeys. The imagination filled in what pixels couldn't provide. An ampersand became a demon lord. A series of dashes transformed into a corridor stretching into digital darkness.
Commercial viability remained elusive. No distribution mechanism, no way to monetize mainframe time.
Which brings us to the fascinating pivot of 1980 to 1981. Personal computers, the Apple II, the Commodore PET, suddenly made digital RPGs possible outside university walls. And 2 games would define the entire genre's future trajectory, Wizardry and Ultima. Both released in 1981, both created by individuals or tiny teams, both translating mainframe concepts to home computers. Yet they couldn't have been more philosophically different. Wizardry, created by Andrew Greenberg and Robert Woodhead, was the dungeon crawler perfected. First-person perspective, turn-based combat, unforgiving difficulty that deleted characters permanently upon death. It presented RPG as ordeal, demanding player dedication that bordered on obsession. The manual warned that a complete playthrough might take several months of careful play. This wasn't entertainment in any conventional sense. It was digital mountaineering. Ultima, by contrast, showed Richard Garriott's vision of RPG as world. Top-down perspective revealing an entire kingdom, towns to visit, NPCs to consult, a narrative beyond retrieve the artifact from level 10. Where Wizardry trapped players in claustrophobic corridors, Ultima offered digital wandering. Both games fit on a single floppy disk, roughly 140 kilobytes, Yet they established design philosophies that would echo for decades.
Japanese developers took notice, particularly Yuji Horii and Hironobu Sakaguchi. They played these games obsessively, seeing potential for transformation.
And here's where our story takes its most crucial turn. These Japanese designers went beyond simply copying Western RPGs. They performed an act of cultural translation that would reshape gaming forever. Horii played Wizardry and Ultima, yes, but he also understood something fundamental. Japanese audiences, particularly on the Famicom, included children and casual players who would never tolerate Wizardry's punishing difficulty or Ultima's keyboard commands. So Dragon Quest, released in 1986, became an exercise in radical simplification that was actually radical innovation. 4 buttons instead of an entire keyboard. Automatic staircase navigation instead of requiring a specific command. Colorful sprite graphics instead of wireframe dungeons. Most crucially, and this is what Western critics initially missed, Dragon Quest recast the RPG as a fairy tale. Players were no longer only statistical constructs gaining experience points. They became legendary heroes descended from Erdrick, saving Princess Laura, defeating the Dragon Lord. Mythology became accessible to 8-year-olds. The game fit in 64 kilobytes, yet it contained an entire coherent world. Towns with distinct personalities, NPCs who offered cryptic hints, a sense of journey and progression that went beyond numerical advancement. Where Western RPGs were becoming increasingly complex, Ultima 4 would soon track 8 separate virtues across an entire moral system. Dragon Quest asked, what if we made the epic intimate?
Final Fantasy followed in 1987. Square's desperate gamble, more elaborate narrative, technical innovations maximizing NES capabilities.
Square's beautiful desperation. They named it Final Fantasy because bankruptcy loomed. Create something magical or close forever. Hironobu Sakaguchi poured everything into it. Where Dragon Quest offered comfort and familiarity, Final Fantasy pushed boundaries. 4 character parties with job classes. Vehicles that opened new areas. Ship, canoe, airship. A story that spanned continents and centuries, involving time loops and ancient prophecies. But notice the philosophical divergence already crystallizing. Western RPGs on computers grew ever more complex. Character creation screens with dozens of statistics, moral choices with lasting consequences, open worlds where you could ignore the main quest entirely. Console RPGs, particularly from Japan, chose guided experiences, preset characters with personal stories, linear but emotionally resonant narratives, accessibility over simulation. Neither approach was superior. They served different human needs. The Western RPG embodied the fantasy of total agency, become anyone, do anything. The JRPG embodied the fantasy of meaningful destiny. You are the chosen one, your journey matters. Both fantasies were essential, both valid, each planting seeds that would bloom magnificently in the decade to come. The 1980s did more than create a genre. They established 2 parallel philosophies of digital storytelling, setting the stage for the creative explosion that would follow.
By 1989, the split was complete. 2 design philosophies, expanding audiences, the foundation for the 16-bit revolution. But beneath these creative divergences, a quiet technical revolution was underway, one that would fundamentally alter how we experience these digital worlds.
Ah yes, the hardware beneath the dreams, the circuitry that would make permanence possible. Tell us, Zex, what innovations were brewing in those silicon workshops?
The late 1980s brought together several technical innovations that would fundamentally reshape role-playing games. Consider battery-backed save systems, a simple lithium battery soldered to a cartridge board, maintaining SRAM contents when powered off. The Legend of Zelda pioneered this on the Famicom Disk System in 1986, but Dragon Warrior's 1989 North American release marked the first time Western console RPG players could maintain persistent game states without passwords. The technical specifications are worth examining. A CR2032 battery provided approximately 3 volts to maintain 8 kilobytes of battery-backed SRAM. Expected lifespan, 5 to 10 years depending on temperature conditions. This small component enabled something profound. Games could now remember, not just high scores or basic progress markers, but entire world states, character statistics, inventory contents, story flags, NPC interactions. Suddenly, every action had permanence. Dragon Warrior utilized this to track 2,048 individual data points across its game world. Compare this to password systems, which could encode perhaps 64 bits of information, enough for level, location, and basic inventory, but nothing approaching a living world. The battery went beyond simply saving progress. It made entirely new design paradigms possible.
Permanence as revolution. Those little batteries were time machines, weren't they? Suspending our adventures in amber until we returned.
Memory economics drove these changes. In 1980, ROM cost approximately $30 per kilobit. By 1989, that dropped to under $1. Cartridge sizes expanded accordingly. Early Famicom games used 24 kilobit ROMs. Dragon Quest III shipped on a 4 megabit cartridge, a 170-fold increase in just 6 years. This extra space went primarily to 3 areas: expanded worlds, deeper mechanics, and most crucially, text. Consider translation requirements. Japanese uses approximately 2,000 common kanji, but each character conveys significant meaning. A Japanese RPG might tell its story in 40,000 characters. English translation typically required 2 to 3 times that amount. Dragon Warrior's English script used 70,000 characters. At 8 bits per character, that's 560 kilobits, over 10% of the total cartridge space, just for text. Nintendo of America's localization strategy for Dragon Warrior was particularly interesting. They manufactured 500,000 cartridges and gave them away with Nintendo Power subscriptions. The financial calculation was deliberate: lose money on distribution to create an audience for future titles. They simplified gameplay mechanics, added extensive hint guides, removed religious symbols and alcohol references. The assumption was that American players needed gentler introduction to the genre's conventions.
Cultural imperialism through kindness. Though perhaps they were right, meeting players where they were, rather than where designers wished them to be.
Simultaneously, computer RPGs explored different territory. Strategic Simulations Inc.'s Gold Box series launched with Pool of Radiance in 1988. These games implemented advanced Dungeons & Dragons rules with unprecedented fidelity. That-Zero calculations, multi-classing, spell memorization, every tabletop complexity translated to code. The engine tracked over 100 statistics per character. Combat occurred on tactical grids with facing, opportunity attacks, and environmental obstacles. The technical requirements were substantial. Minimum 512 kilobytes RAM, recommended 640 kilobytes. Games shipped on multiple 5.25-inch floppy disks. Pool of Radiance used 8 disks, requiring constant swapping during play. Load times between areas could exceed 90 seconds. Yet PC RPG players accepted these inconveniences for deeper simulation. This illustrates the emerging philosophical divide. Console RPGs, constrained by controller input and younger audiences, emphasized accessibility and guided narrative. Computer RPGs, with keyboards and mature players, pursued complexity and player agency. Dragon Warrior offered 4 commands in battle: fight, run, spell, item. Pool of Radiance's combat menu contained over 20 options, with submenus for movement types, spell schools, and tactical actions.
2 languages emerging from the same root tongue, like Latin splitting into Romance languages, each carrying different music.
The data supports this divergence. By 1990, the average console RPG completion time was 20 to 30 hours. Computer RPGs averaged 60 to 80 hours. Console RPGs featured preset protagonists with defined story arcs. Computer RPGs emphasized character creation with randomized statistics and party composition. Console games used menu-driven interfaces optimized for controllers. Computer games employed mouse-driven interfaces with keyboard shortcuts. These weren't arbitrary choices. They emerged from platform constraints. A Super Nintendo controller had 8 buttons. A PC keyboard had 101 keys. Console games output to television screens viewed from 6 to 8 feet away. Computer monitors sat 18 inches from players' faces. Every interface decision flowed from these physical realities. Yet both branches were heading toward the same destination, the 1990s. Memory prices continued falling. CD-ROM technology promised 650 megabytes of storage, over 100 times what cartridges could hold. 16-bit processors could push more pixels, calculate more complex systems, tell richer stories. The foundation was complete. 2 design philosophies, multiple technological platforms, and an audience hungry for deeper experiences.
The stage was architected, wired, and waiting for the curtain to rise. What symphonies would play in that theatre? The late 1980s brought us two competing visions of the Japanese RPG. Dragon Quest had established the template, accessible, charming, built on proven Western foundations. But in December 1987, a desperate gamble from a dying company would create its greatest rival and reshape our understanding of what JRPGs could achieve. Square faced bankruptcy. They'd released a string of Famicom failures. The company planned to close after one final project. Hironobu Sakaguchi, a young designer who'd wanted to quit game development entirely, agreed to direct this swan song. He called it Final Fantasy, though he later admitted the name came less from fatalism and more from wanting FF to look good in abbreviated displays. Still, there's delicious irony in a Final Fantasy spawning one of gaming's most enduring franchises. What emerged wasn't your typical Dragon Quest clone. Sakaguchi's team implemented crucial innovations: a four-person party with distinct job classes, side-view battles that showed character sprites instead of first-person perspective, and a magic system using spell charges rather than traditional MP. But the most radical decision was conceptual. Unlike Dragon Quest's continuous narrative, each Final Fantasy would exist independently. New world, new characters, new gameplay systems. Only thematic elements, crystals, summons, recurring creatures like chocobos, would carry forward.
Creative freedom through discontinuity. No sequel obligations. Each entry could experiment without destroying established lore.
This philosophy of constant reinvention became Final Fantasy's defining characteristic. Where other franchises built cathedrals brick by brick, Square burned down the church and rebuilt it for every installment. The approach risked alienating fans who wanted more of the same, but it also prevented the stagnation that plagues long-running series. Every Final Fantasy could be someone's first. Every game could be someone's favorite. The series truly found its voice with Final Fantasy IV in 1991. This wasn't mere mechanical innovation, though the active time battle system that added real-time pressure to turn-based combat was certainly that. It was the first serious attempt at sophisticated characterization in a console RPG. Cecil Harvey's arc from Dark Knight to Paladin was more than narrative window dressing. The transformation happened mechanically, stripping him of power before rebuilding him anew. Players experienced redemption as gameplay, but the musical evolution might have been even more significant. Nobuo Uematsu had been composing for the series since the beginning, but the SNES sound chip finally gave him the tools to match his ambitions. That opening harp glissando, the prelude, became gaming's Once Upon a Time. Every subsequent Final Fantasy would begin with that crystalline promise: we're about to tell you a story that matters.
Uematsu maximized the SNES's 8-channel sound capability. Layered instrumentation, dynamic volume control, the technical improvements enabled emotional complexity.
By 1994's Final Fantasy VI, Square had fully embraced narrative ambition. No single protagonist, instead, 14 playable characters whose stories interweaved across a world that mixed magic with Steam technology. The game's midpoint delivered an unprecedented gut punch. The villain wins. Kefka achieves godhood and breaks the world. The second half becomes about finding meaning in ruins, gathering your scattered party from a scarred landscape where hope itself seems naive. Consider the opera scene, Maria and Draco, where players control Celis in an actual performance, hitting cues and remembering lyrics. Uematsu coaxed something resembling human voices from a sound chip designed for Mario jumps. Players who'd never attended an opera found themselves moved by synthesized vocals singing nonsense syllables. It was audacious, pretentious even. It was exactly what video games needed to grow up. The series might have continued its SNES refinements indefinitely, but 1997 changed everything. Square's decision to develop Final Fantasy VII for Sony's PlayStation instead of Nintendo's cartridge-based Nintendo 64 sent shockwaves through the industry. The reasoning was purely technical. Sakaguchi's vision required CD-ROM storage for full-motion video and pre-rendered backgrounds. But the implications were seismic.
3 CDs, over 40 minutes of CGI cutscenes, development budget $45 million, marketing budget $100 million, unprecedented figures for 1997.
Those marketing dollars bought something revolutionary: mainstream attention. Television commercials during primetime programming, spreads in non-gaming magazines. Square transformed the launch into a cultural event, not merely a product release. The commercials showed exclusively cutscenes, no gameplay, pure spectacle. Critics called it deceptive, sales called it brilliant. The game itself delivered on most of its promises. Cloud Strife's journey from cocky mercenary to broken man, reconstructing his identity, touched on themes: environmentalism, corporate exploitation, the reliability of memory, that most games wouldn't dare approach. The Midgar opening remains a masterclass in world-building through constraint. 7 hours in a single city, layers of literal and metaphorical oppression before the world map reveals itself in all its polygonal glory. And then Aerith died, not in battle, not heroically holding off enemies while the party escaped. Murdered in a cutscene beyond player control. No Phoenix Down could help, no last-minute rescue would come. Just Sephiroth's sword, Aerith's prayer, and a generation of players learning that sometimes games could break your heart on purpose.
Sales exceeded 10 million units. System seller for PlayStation, proved JRPGs could achieve mainstream Western success.
The influence rippled outward immediately. Every RPG suddenly needed CGI cutscenes, orchestral scores, multiple discs. Some understood that Final Fantasy VII's appeal went deeper than production values. It was the ambition, the willingness to be unabashedly earnest about love and loss and saving the world. Others just saw dollar signs and polygon counts. What's fascinating is how the series refused to rest on that achievement. Final Fantasy VIII pushed philosophical science fiction. Ike's returned to medieval fantasy with knowing self-awareness. X embraced voice acting and linear storytelling. X's went online. 12 automated party members. The 30 tried something. Even failures like 30's beautiful corridor simulator or XV's bizarre road trip demonstrate the franchise's compulsive need to reinvent itself. The cultural penetration extends beyond gaming. Tetsuya Nomura's character designs, all zippers and belts and impossible hair, influenced fashion and cosplay culture. Uematsu's compositions get performed by world-class orchestras. The series spawned successful fighting games, rhythm games, tactics games, mobile games. It became a lifestyle brand while never quite forgetting it started as one desperate team's final shot.
Current sales over 185 million units worldwide, highest grossing JRPG franchise, cultural impact immeasurable.
But perhaps the deepest legacy is permission. Permission to be melodramatic. Permission to take teenagers saving the world seriously. Permission to cry when pixels die. In an era of ironic detachment and knowing winks, Final Fantasy wore its emotions on its ridiculously oversized sleeves. That sincerity, that commitment to feeling everything at maximum volume, gave other developers permission to care too much. The influence on independent developers particularly fascinates. Zeboyd Games built their entire catalog on loving Final Fantasy homage. Cosmic Star Heroine borrowed the ATB system wholesale. Even designers working in other genres cite Final Fantasy's narrative ambition as inspiration. The series proved games could make players feel something beyond frustration or triumph. Which brings us naturally to the 16-bit era that produced many of these innovations. The SNES years, roughly 1990 to 1996, would prove to be the genre's creative peak. Technical limitations had finally relaxed enough to enable ambition while remaining tight enough to enforce focus. What emerged was nothing less than the golden age of the JRPG, with achievements that developers still chase 30 years later.
Ready to examine that era's technical innovations? The SNES specifically enabled numerous breakthrough titles.
The 16-bit era remains gaming's renaissance period, when technical capability finally caught up with creative ambition.
The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, 1990 in Japan, 1991 in North America. Technical specifications: 16-bit 65C816 CPU, running at 3.58 MHz, 128 kilobytes of RAM. Mode 7 graphics allowing pseudo 3D effects through background layer rotation and scaling. Sample-based audio synthesis supporting 8 channels simultaneously. These numbers might seem quaint now, but they represented a quantum leap from the NES. Suddenly, developers had enough memory to create expansive worlds, enough processing power for complex gameplay systems, enough audio channels for orchestral arrangements. The canvas had expanded dramatically. The early 90s saw Japanese RPG development reach what many consider its creative peak. Square led the charge with a string of masterpieces: Final Fantasy IV through V6, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger. Enix countered with Dragon Quest V and V6. Each pushed the hardware in different directions, finding ingenious solutions to technical limitations. Take Secret of Mana, released in 1993. The game supported 3-player simultaneous action RPG gameplay, unprecedented for console RPGs. The technical challenge was immense. 3 separate characters meant triple the sprite processing, triple the collision detection, triple the AI calculations. Director Koichi Ishii's team had to optimize every line of code. They developed a custom data compression algorithm just to fit all the graphics into the cartridge.
3 friends huddled around one television, each controlling their own destiny. The social dynamics alone were revolutionary.
But Secret of Mana was originally far more ambitious. The initial design targeted the never-released SNES CD-ROM add-on. When Nintendo canceled that peripheral, Square had to compress their vision dramatically. An entire second half of the game was cut. Major story sequences removed. The rushed compression shows in places, plot threads that lead nowhere, areas that feel strangely empty. Yet even truncated, it demonstrated the era's experimental spirit. The ring menu system, holding a button brought up circular menus that didn't pause the action, became widely imitated. The way magic spells could be charged up by holding the button, with different visual effects for each charge level, required careful sprite management within the SNES's limitations. Memory management became an art form during this period. Cartridge space was expensive. Larger games required special chips that drove up manufacturing costs. Developers became obsessed with compression techniques. They'd reuse tiles creatively, making a rock formation do double duty as a cloud with different coloring. They'd design sprites that could be flipped and recolored to create enemy variants without using additional memory.
Limitation as liberation. Every constraint became a creative challenge.
The audio evolution was equally dramatic. The SNES's Sony SE700 sound chip could play digitized samples, not just synthesized beeps. Composers could use actual instrument recordings, though heavily compressed. Nobuo Uematsu famously spent weeks getting the opera scene in Final Fantasy VI to work within the technical constraints. He had to create the illusion of human voices using careful sample manipulation and creative sequencing. David Wise's work on Donkey Kong Country pushed even further, using a technique called wave sequencing to create evolving ambient soundscapes that seemed impossible on the hardware. Though not an RPG, its technical audio innovations influenced the entire industry. But the crown jewel of SNES RPG development arrived in 1995, Chrono Trigger. Assembled by Square's Dream Team, Hironobu Sakaguchi from Final Fantasy, Yuji Horii from Dragon Quest, and Akira Toriyama of Dragon Ball fame, it represented the culmination of everything learned during the 16-bit generation. The technical achievements were staggering. No separate battle screens. Enemies appeared on the map and combat happened in the same environment. This seems simple now, but on SNES it required loading enemy sprites and battle UI without any loading pause. Programmer Katsuhisa Higuchi later described the extreme difficulty of implementing this seamlessly. They had to predict which enemies might be encountered and preload their graphics into the limited sprite memory.
The future bleeding into the present. Time travel as both narrative device and technical metaphor.
The time travel system created unique challenges. 7 different eras, each with distinct tile sets, palettes, and music. But cartridge space was limited. The team developed a sophisticated compression system that could decompress map data on the fly. They stored only the differences between time periods for recurring locations, rebuilding maps in real time as players moved between eras. The multiple endings, 13 in the original release, required tracking numerous story flags throughout the game. This ate up precious save file space. The SNES cartridge's battery-backed SRAM could only hold so much data. They had to optimize every bit, using single bits as flags where possible, packing multiple variables into single bytes. Combat innovation continued with the dual and triple techs, combination attacks between party members. Each required unique animations, eating up sprite memory. The solution was procedural animation blending. They'd store keyframes and interpolate between them in real time, creating smooth combination attacks without storing every frame.
Mathematics creating magic, code transformed into spectacle.
The active time battle system version 2.0 added positioning to the formula. Enemy and character placement mattered for area effect attacks. This required constant distance calculations between all battlefield entities, expensive on a processor designed for 2D sprite manipulation. They optimized by using lookup tables for trigonometric functions and simplified distance calculations that were good enough for gameplay purposes. Even with all these innovations, the team wanted more. They originally planned for Chrono Trigger to include more time periods, more playable characters, more everything. The 32 megabit cartridge, already large and expensive for 1995, still wasn't enough. Content was cut, storylines condensed, areas simplified.
And yet what remained was perfection. Sometimes the frame enhances the painting.
The legacy extends beyond individual games. The SNES era established patterns still followed today. The idea that RPGs should push hardware limits, that technical innovation should serve narrative ambition, that constraints breed creativity. Modern indie developers study these games obsessively. They reverse engineer the tile reuse patterns, the compression algorithms, the sprite layering tricks. Tools like Lunar Magic let fans peek behind the curtain of games like Final Fantasy VI, revealing the extraordinary craftsmanship required to create those experiences. The SNES couldn't do 3D graphics, not really. It couldn't stream CD-quality audio. It couldn't display thousands of colors simultaneously. But within those boundaries, developers created experiences that still resonate. They proved that technical mastery means understanding your limitations as deeply as your capabilities.
The 16-bit era ended not with a whimper, but a paradox. Games so perfect within their constraints that advancing technology almost seemed like a step backward. When Chrono Trigger finally received a PlayStation port years later, the loading times made it inferior to the cartridge original. Picture this: 1992, Square's headquarters in Tokyo. Three titans of Japanese gaming sit around a conference table, sketching out what would become one of the most celebrated RPGs ever created. Hironobu Sakaguchi, fresh off Final Fantasy's growing success. Yuji Horii, the mind behind Dragon Quest's accessibility revolution. And Akira Toriyama, whose Dragon Ball characters had already conquered manga and anime. They called themselves the Dream Team, though that name understates the audacity of what they were attempting. The collaboration itself was unprecedented. Square and Enix were fierce rivals. Their flagship franchises, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, competed for the same audience. Yet here was Horii, Enix's golden boy, working directly with Square. The project began almost as a dare between Sakaguchi and Horii at an industry gathering. They'd been drinking, discussing their mutual admiration for each other's work, when someone suggested, why not make a game together? Toriyama's involvement added another layer of complexity. His fee alone was astronomical. Manga superstars didn't typically do video game work. But Sakaguchi and Horii knew that Toriyama's character designs could bridge the gap between their different design philosophies. Dragon Quest emphasized simplicity and charm. Final Fantasy pushed for complexity and drama. Toriyama's art style could unify these approaches.
The initial plan was even more ambitious: development for the SNES CD add-on.
The great what-if of gaming history. Nintendo's partnership with Sony to create a CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo. The Dream Team envisioned Chrono Trigger as a showcase for this new technology. CD storage would allow for fully orchestrated music, voiced dialogue, animated cutscenes. Masato Kato, the scenario writer, drafted a story that would span dozens of hours across multiple time periods. But as we know, that partnership imploded spectacularly. Nintendo, fearing Sony's growing influence, secretly partnered with Philips instead. Sony took their technology and created the PlayStation. The SNES CD died before it lived. And suddenly, the Dream Team's grand vision had to fit on a cartridge.
This forced a complete redesign. Features were cut, the scope narrowed.
Yet constraint became catalyst. Kato had originally written over a dozen time periods. The cartridge limitations forced him to condense to 7: prehistory, antiquity, Middle Ages, present, apocalypse, future, and the end of time. Each era became more focused, more thematically distinct. The prehistoric era explores the dawn of humanity. Antiquity examines hubris through the magical kingdom of zeal. The apocalypse shows the consequences of unchecked technology. This compression extended to the cast. Early drafts included over 20 playable characters. The final game has 7, but what characters they are. Chrono, the silent protagonist whose heroic sacrifice shocked players accustomed to invincible heroes. Mal, whose rebellion against royal duty drives the initial plot. Luca, the inventor whose technological optimism gets tempered by tragedy. Each character embodies their era's themes while remaining uniquely themselves.
The technical team performed miracles with data compression.
Miracles built on months of sleepless nights. Programmer Keizo Kokubo developed new compression algorithms specifically for Chrono Trigger. They analyzed every asset, finding ways to reuse and recombine data. The famous campfire scene, where the party shares their reasons for fighting, reuses background elements from 6 different locations, seamlessly blended to create the illusion of a unique area. Music posed particular challenges. Yasunori Mitsuda, composing his first game soundtrack, wanted orchestral depth on hardware designed for simple melodies. He worked himself literally to collapse, developing stomach ulcers that hospitalized him. Nobuo Uematsu stepped in to complete the soundtrack, but Mitsuda's compositions define the game's emotional core. The main theme alone went through dozens of iterations, each version tested against the SNES sound chip's limitations, until they achieved that perfect balance of melancholy and hope.
The development timeline was brutal. 2 years of continuous crunch.
And it shows in the details. Every sprite animation was handcrafted. Toriyama would draw the keyframes, and Square's pixel artists would painstakingly translate them. The team developed new tools just to handle Toriyama's art style. His characteristic rounded forms and dynamic poses didn't naturally fit the square grid pixel art format. But perhaps the most innovative aspect was how they approached player choice. Most RPGs of the era were strictly linear beneath their open-world facades. Chrono Trigger's time travel allowed for genuine consequence. Save the forest in 600 AD, and it flourishes in 1000 AD. Fail to prevent a character's ancestor from dying, and they vanish from existence. The impact went far beyond dialogue tweaks. Entire aspects of the game world could shift as a result.
The multiple endings weren't originally planned. They emerged from a bug.
A glorious accident. During testing, a glitch allowed players to access the final boss much earlier than intended. Rather than fix it, the team embraced it. They created different endings based on when Lavos was defeated, turning a bug into a feature that would influence game design for decades. New Game Plus became more than a simple replay mode. It invited players to revisit the story from new perspectives and discover how confronting destiny at different moments could reshape everything. The game's release in March 1995 represented the SNES at its absolute peak. Every department at Square contributed their best work. Marketing created elaborate promotional materials. The strategy guide, written in-house, contained lore and artwork that expanded the world beyond the game itself. Even the box art, featuring Toriyama's illustration of the cast gathered together, promised an epic that transcended typical genre boundaries. Critical reception was euphoric. Famitsu awarded it near-perfect scores. American gaming magazines, often skeptical of JRPGs, hailed it as a masterpiece. Sales were strong, but not phenomenal. Final Fantasy VI had set high expectations. But Chrono Trigger's influence spread like ripples through the industry.
Many techniques pioneered here became industry standard.
The seamless battle transitions inspired everything from Final Fantasy XII to modern action RPGs. The multiple ending structure influenced games across all genres. The New Game Plus concept is now ubiquitous. But beyond mechanics, Chrono Trigger proved something vital, that dream collaborations could work, that rivals could create magic together, that technical limitations could spark rather than stifle creativity. Years later, when asked about the development, Sakaguchi said the team never felt they were making a typical RPG. They believed they were creating something timeless, a game about time that would transcend its own era. Looking back, it's hard to argue they failed. Chrono Trigger remains a touchstone, a game developers study and players cherish, a reminder that sometimes dreams do come true, even if they have to fit on a 32-megabit cartridge.
While Chrono Trigger represented the SNES era's technical apex, another 1995 release took a radically different approach. EarthBound arrived in North America with scratch-and-sniff advertisements proclaiming, "This game stinks." The marketing campaign cost more than the localization itself. Nintendo spent approximately $2 million promoting a game that would sell fewer than 140,000 copies in its initial run. The technical specifications tell an interesting story. EarthBound shipped on a 24-megabit cartridge, smaller than Chrono Trigger's 32 megabits. Yet it contained one of the longest scripts in SNES history. The Japanese version alone featured over 80,000 text characters. Ted Woolsey, who localized Chrono Trigger in 30 days, passed on EarthBound. The localization took Marcus Lindblom 6 months of solitary work. He had to compress dialogue, rewrite cultural references, and somehow preserve Shigesato Otoi's distinctive voice. Compression became critical. HAL Laboratory developed custom algorithms specifically for EarthBound's text storage. They achieved approximately 50% compression ratio on dialogue, impressive for 1994. The game's graphics used similar tricks. Background tiles were reused extensively. The famous psychedelic battle backgrounds? Procedurally generated patterns using mathematical functions. Each background required only a few kilobytes of ROM space instead of storing full images.
Mathematics as psychedelia. There's something delicious about that, using sine waves and color cycling to simulate the experience of battling abstract concepts and sentient piles of vomit. Itoi approached game design as the creation of a fever dream, Americana filtered through Japanese sensibilities, surreal and unforgettable.
The development history explains much of the game's unique character. Work began in 1989, immediately after Mother 1's Famicom release. By 1993, the project was failing. 4 years of development, no end in sight. The codebase had become unmanageable. Multiple programmers had contributed incompatible modules. Memory allocation was chaotic. Basic features weren't functioning. Enter Satoru Iwata. At the time, he was a programmer at HAL Laboratory, not yet Nintendo's president. He analyzed the code for 1 week. His assessment was blunt. Continuing would take 2 more years. Starting over would take 6 months. Nintendo executives were skeptical. Iwata began rewriting the entire game engine from scratch. He completed the core systems in approximately 1 month.
1 month to resurrect a 4-year disaster. That's not programming. That's alchemy. Though I suppose when you're dealing with a game where you fight sentient traffic signs and travel through time via psychedelic tea, a little magic in the development process seems fitting.
Iwata's approach was methodical. He created standardized data structures for all game objects, implemented a unified scripting system for events and dialogue, developed debugging tools that let designers test changes immediately. Most importantly, he established memory budgets for each game system. Graphics, 8 megabits, audio, 4 megabits, scripts, 6 megabits, game logic, 6 megabits, every byte accounted for. The rolling HP meter emerged from these constraints. Traditional RPGs updated health instantly after damage. EarthBound couldn't afford the memory for complex battle animations. Instead, they created the odometer-style counter. Damage triggered a countdown rather than immediate deduction. This saved memory, no need for elaborate death animations, while adding strategic depth. Players could heal characters or end battles before fatal damage registered.
Constraint as catalyst, once again. The rolling meter transformed every deadly blow into a miniature time management puzzle. Your party member takes 500 damage, but has 400 HP. Quick, end the battle before the counter reaches 0. It turned panic into opportunity, making battles feel more dynamic than any amount of flashy graphics could achieve.
Other technical
And yet, for all its technical wizardry, EarthBound's deepest innovations were conceptual. A JRPG set in contemporary suburbia, psychic powers fueled by homesickness, final boss battles against the embodiment of evil itself, defeated not through strength, but through prayer. Itoy took every JRPG convention and asked, what if we did the opposite?
The audio system deserves particular attention. Hip Tanaka and Keiichi Suzuki composed the soundtrack using extensive sampling, unusual for SNES games. They incorporated snippets of Beatles songs, Beach Boys harmonies, and electronic music. The SNES sound chip typically handled synthesized instruments. EarthBound pushed it to play compressed audio samples. This required custom playback routines and careful memory management. Battle themes changed based on enemy combinations. The soundtrack contained over 170 distinct tracks, massive for a cartridge game. They achieved this through modular composition. Many songs shared instrumental samples but used different arrangements. The iconic hotel theme? It's the Beatles' Yesterday played backwards with echo effects. Legal concerns prevented direct sampling, so they recreated the effect using the SNES sound chip's capabilities.
Backwards Beatles in a small-town hotel. Could there be a more perfect metaphor for EarthBound's entire aesthetic? Everything familiar made strange, nostalgia twisted into something new. The game's initial commercial failure seems almost inevitable in retrospect. How do you market a game that defies every genre expectation?
Nintendo's marketing data is illuminating. Focus groups responded negatively to the graphics, too simple compared to Donkey Kong Country's pre-rendered sprites. The contemporary setting tested poorly with fantasy-seeking RPG fans. The humor didn't translate in brief demonstrations. Nintendo compensated with the $2 million campaign, including the scratch and sniff cards. Result, 140,000 copies sold. Total revenue barely covered marketing costs.
This game stinks. Perhaps the most catastrophically literal marketing campaign in gaming history. Though there's poetry in that failure too. EarthBound was too weird for 1995, too sincere for ironic marketing, too heartfelt for players expecting epic fantasy. It needed time to find its people, and find them it did, just slowly. Very slowly.
The technical influence extends beyond what most realize. Remember that auto-battle resolution system I mentioned? When you touched a weak enemy, the game calculated whether you'd win without displaying the battle screen. You received experience instantly. First SNES RPG to implement this optimization.
A decade before anyone coined quality of life improvements, EarthBound was quietly respecting the player's time. No wonder it became a touchstone for indie developers. It demonstrated that innovation didn't require cutting-edge graphics or orchestral scores. Sometimes, the most radical act was simply asking, what if we didn't waste the player's time? But let me tell you about the real cult formation, because it's a story of digital archaeology and collective determination. EarthBound vanished from North American shelves by 1996. No digital storefront, no re-releases, no official acknowledgement from Nintendo for nearly 2 decades. The game might have disappeared entirely if not for a peculiar confluence of factors: the emerging emulation scene, the birth of online communities, and most crucially, a single website that refused to let EarthBound die. Starmen.net launched in 1999, created by fans who discovered the game through rental stores or second-hand shops. They began documenting everything: enemy stats, item locations, obscure dialogue variations. When EarthBound's sequel, Mother 3, released only in Japan in 2006, this community did something unprecedented. They organized a professional-quality fan translation that took 2 years and involved linguists, programmers, and artists. The translation patch was downloaded over 1 million times, proving substantial Western interest in a failed franchise.
The technical achievement of that translation deserves recognition. GBA ROM hacking in 2006 required reverse engineering compression algorithms, font rendering systems, and text display routines. Mother 3 used variable width fonts, unusual for Japanese games. The team had to rewrite display algorithms to handle English text properly.
Professional game translators called it one of the finest localizations ever produced, fan or official. But here's where the story transforms from preservation to inspiration. Around 2008, something shifted in the indie development scene. Suddenly, everyone was citing EarthBound as an influence.
The timing aligns with several technical developments. GameMaker became freely available. Unity launched in 2005. Digital distribution through services like Steam removed publishing barriers. Developers who'd grown up with EarthBound now had tools to create their own games.
And create they did, but not simple clones or nostalgic retreads. They absorbed EarthBound's deeper lessons about subverting expectations, mixing humor with genuine emotion, and finding beauty in the mundane. Consider the games that emerged from this influence, each taking a different aspect of EarthBound's DNA and mutating it into something new. Lisa, the painful RPG, released in 2014, took EarthBound's suburban setting and emotional core, but stripped away the whimsy, creating a post-apocalyptic meditation on masculinity and trauma. The developer explicitly cited EarthBound's willingness to tackle serious themes through unconventional means. A postmodern RPG attempted to transplant EarthBound's sensibilities to 1990s hipster culture, though its reception proved, let's say, mixed. Yet even in failure, it demonstrated EarthBound's influence on ambitious narrative experiments. Citizens of Earth quite literally pitched itself as EarthBound meets Pokemon meets Suikoden, wearing its influence proudly while adding political satire to the mix.
Most significantly, Undertale. Toby Fox participated in the EarthBound fan community, creating ROM hacks before developing his own game. Undertale's technical design directly references EarthBound. The menu sounds, the rolling HP system, the emphasis on quirky NPCs with memorable dialogue.
But Undertale went further than homage. Where EarthBound asked players to pray for the final boss, Undertale questioned the very premise of fighting. It expanded on EarthBound's mechanical ideas, exploring what happens if enemies are misunderstood, if violence can be avoided, and if the game itself remembers your every choice.
The influence spread beyond direct homages. Modern indie RPGs routinely implement features EarthBound pioneered. Auto-resolving trivial battles appears in Persona 5, Cosmic Star Heroine, even AAA titles like Final Fantasy XII. The rolling HP meter shows up everywhere, from indie darlings to major releases.
But perhaps the deepest legacy isn't mechanical, but philosophical. EarthBound proved that RPGs could be personal, idiosyncratic, even autobiographical. Shigesato Itoi based the game on his own childhood memories and anxieties. That permission to be personal, to make games that reflected individual experience rather than market research, that became the indie RPG ethos. When Nintendo finally acknowledged EarthBound's cult status, releasing it on Virtual Console in 2013, it felt less like a revival and more like a coronation. The weird little game that failed had become a foundational text, studied and referenced and beloved by a generation of creators.
Sales data from the Virtual Console release. EarthBound consistently ranked in the top 10 for over a year. Physical cartridge prices, which had reached $200 due to scarcity, finally stabilized. Nintendo has since included it in their classic game collections. Complete reversal from its initial commercial failure.
20 years to transform from commercial disaster to canonical classic. There's hope in that trajectory, isn't there? Sometimes the world just isn't ready. Sometimes you need a generation to grow up, find your work in the dusty corners of the internet, and say, yes, this is what games could be. And with that transformation in mind, perhaps we should examine what happened when the entire industry underwent its own metamorphosis. The leap to 3D, the Western RPG revival, the moment when everything changed.
The paradigm shift began precisely on January 31st, 1997. Final Fantasy VII's release on PlayStation. Not the first 3D RPG, but the moment everything changed. Square abandoned Nintendo's cartridges for Sony's CD-ROM format. That decision altered the entire landscape. Consider the technical implications. CD-ROMs offered 650 megabytes versus cartridge limitations of 4 to 32 megabytes. Suddenly, developers could include full-motion video, CD-quality audio, pre-rendered backgrounds. But the trade-off was severe. Loading times. Every screen transition required disk reads. Players waited 3 to 5 seconds between areas. Some games masked this with corridor sections or elevator rides. Others simply made players endure black screens. The rendering pipeline completely transformed. 2D sprites required pixel artists drawing frame by frame. 3D models needed modelers, texture artists, riggers, animators. Team sizes exploded. Final Fantasy VI had approximately 35 developers. Final Fantasy VII required over 100. Budget increased from $5 million to $45 million. The economics fundamentally shifted.
The great gamble of the CD era, trading instantaneous cartridge access for vast storage, trading intimate teams for industrial production. Did the soul survive the transition?
Different souls emerged. Let me detail the technical evolution. PlayStation's 33 MHz processor could handle approximately 360,000 flat-shaded polygons per second. Compare that to Super Nintendo's Mode 7 effects, pseudo 3D at best, true polygonal characters moving through space. But early 3D was crude. Final Fantasy VII's field models had roughly 300 to 400 polygons each. Cloud's blocky hands became infamous. Square's solution was ingenious: pre-rendered backgrounds. They created detailed 3D environments in Silicon Graphics workstations, rendered them as 2D images, then had polygonal characters walk through these static paintings. It created the illusion of graphical fidelity beyond PlayStation's capabilities. Memory usage, 2 MB for system RAM, meant constantly streaming data from disk. Background images compressed using proprietary algorithms. Character models simplified to fit constraints.
A beautiful deception. Theatre flats and polygonal actors, creating depth through sleight of hand rather than raw computational power.
Precisely. Other developers took different approaches. Xenogears mixed 2D sprites with 3D environments, acknowledging the superior expressiveness of hand-drawn animation while embracing 3D camera movement. Dragon Quest VII waited until 2000 to attempt 3D, maintaining 2D sprites even then. Conservative but effective. Meanwhile, Western developers pursued entirely different philosophies. Interplay released Fallout in 1997. No 3D graphics, isometric 2D sprites, turn-based combat, special stat system. But the design philosophy was revolutionary: complete player agency. Every quest had multiple solutions: violence, stealth, dialogue, all viable. The engine, built in-house, prioritized systemic interactions over graphical prowess.
While Japan chased cinematic spectacle, the West rediscovered systemic depth. Two divergent paths through the digital revolution.
BioWare's Infinity engine powered a different renaissance. Baldur's Gate in 1998 pre-rendered isometric backgrounds like Japanese RPGs, but the underlying systems were pure Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rules. Thakuro, saving throws, spell memorization, decades of tabletop complexity translated to silicon. Real-time with pause combat. Not truly turn-based, not fully real-time. You could pause, issue commands, unpause, watch chaos unfold. Pause again. Tactical depth without turn-based tedium. The engine rendered at 640 by 480 resolution, higher than most console games. Required significant RAM, 16 megabytes minimum. PC gaming's advantage, upgradable hardware. The engine's modular design enabled rapid iteration. Planescape Torment used the same technology but emphasized dialogue over combat. The Nameless One could hold conversations with dozens of unique NPCs, each with branching dialogue trees. Text storage became the constraint. Torment contained over 800,000 words of dialogue, more than most novels.
800,000 words. While console RPGs compressed and compromised for voice acting, PC RPGs embraced the infinite canvas of text. Every NPC a potential philosopher, every conversation a branching labyrinth.
Storage wasn't infinite. Even CDs had limits. Clever compression became essential. Baldur's Gate shipped on 5 CDs. Players performed disk swaps when traveling between major areas. Installation sizes grew enormous. Full install required 2.4 gigas of hard drive space when many PCs had 4 to 6 gigabytes total. But the real revolution was modifiability. Infinity Engine exposed game data through simple file formats. Players could edit items, create new areas, script encounters. The modding community exploded. Thousands of fan-made adventures extended game lifespans indefinitely. Console RPGs remained sealed experiences. PC RPGs became collaborative platforms.
The democratization of design. Every player a potential creator. Every game a foundation for infinite variations.
This period also birthed online persistent worlds. Ultima Online launched in 1997. Not the first graphical MMO, but the first to achieve massive scale, 100,000 subscribers within 6 months. Technical achievement, supporting thousands of concurrent players in a shared world. Server architecture had to handle real-time combat, player housing, economic systems. The challenges were immense. Early servers crashed constantly. Player behavior broke carefully designed systems, killing quest NPCs, monopolizing resources, exploiting bugs. Origin had to rapidly iterate, patching weekly. The game evolved through player interaction in ways single-player RPGs never could. EverQuest followed in 1999. Full 3D graphics, unlike Ultima Online's 2D sprites. But the technical demands were severe. Hardware-accelerated 3D graphics cards required. Minimum specifications excluded many players. The social dynamics transformed too. Raids required 40 to 70 players coordinating in real time. Guilds formed complex hierarchies. Virtual economies developed real-world value.
Virtual worlds birthing real communities. The RPG transcending its medium, becoming a social phenomenon, a parallel reality with its own cultures and conflicts.
By 2000, the technological landscape had completely transformed. Console RPGs pursued cinematic presentation. Final Fantasy King would soon feature full voice acting, facial motion capture, orchestral soundtracks. Western RPGs emphasized systemic complexity and player agency. Online RPGs created persistent social spaces. The seed technologies for the next revolution were already emerging. RPG Maker 2000 released in Japan. Suddenly, anyone could create JRPG-style games without programming knowledge. The tool was limited: 32240 resolution, simple scripting language, preset battle systems. But it democratized RPG creation. The first indie wave was beginning, quietly, in bedrooms and forums. Engine licensing became viable. Instead of building from scratch, developers could license Unreal Engine or ID Tech. Costs dropped. Development time shortened. The barrier to entry lowered incrementally. By 2005, the tools existed for small teams to create professional quality RPGs. They just needed the distribution infrastructure. That would come next.
The stage set for revolution. Big studios pushing boundaries of spectacle and systems, while in the shadows, armed with modest tools and immodest dreams, the next generation prepared to reshape everything. The millennium approached like a narrative checkpoint, and with it came a curious phenomenon. The Western RPG renaissance wasn't merely running parallel to the JRPG explosion, it was engaged in a complex dance of influence and counter-influence. Consider Deus Ex in 2000, Warren Spector's cyberpunk prophecy that asked, what if we refused to choose between genres at all? Here was a game that borrowed the statistical progression of RPGs, the immediacy of first-person shooters, the environmental storytelling of immersive sims. J.C. Denton could hack computers, pick locks, sweet-talk guards, or simply shoot his way through, each approach reflected in skill point allocation, each choice reshaping the narrative flow. The game's conspiracy-laden plot unfolded across multiple paths, conversations branching based not only on dialogue choices, but on actions taken 3 levels ago. You could save your brother Paul or let him die. Kill Anna Navarre or spare her. Side with different factions, each convinced they alone understood humanity's future.
System Shock 2 preceded it by a year. Similar hybrid approach. RPG character development, survival horror atmosphere, first-person combat. The engine, Dark Engine, built for Thief, rendered true 3D environments at 640 by 480 or higher.
But notice how both games approached player agency differently than their Japanese contemporaries. Where Final Fantasy offered carefully orchestrated emotional journeys, these Western hybrids presented systemic sandboxes. The narrative emerged from the intersection of player choice and game systems.
The technical implementation was complex. Deus Ex tracked hundreds of variables. Every NPC killed, every email read, every path taken. The scripting system had to account for multiple quest solutions. Memory management became critical. They shipped on 2 CDs despite aggressive compression.
This period also witnessed Morrowind in 2002, Bethesda's meditation on alienation and apotheosis. Dropped on the ash-covered island of Vardenfell with minimal guidance, players confronted a genuinely alien culture. The Dunmer with their ancestor worship and living gods, the Empire's colonial presence, the mysteries of the disappeared Dwemer. The main quest could be completely ignored. You could become a merchant, an assassin, a scholar of obscure texts. The game generated endless anecdotes. Players discovered they could levitate over mountains, craft game-breaking potions, soul-trap gods into petty gems. The journal system, no quest markers, just written directions and accumulating pages, forced actual navigation, actual attention. You could kill essential NPCs and doom the world, greeted only by a cryptic message about severing the threads of prophecy.
Morrowind used Bethesda's NetImmerse engine, later renamed Gamebryo. Full 3D world with no loading screens except when entering buildings. Draw distance was heavily constrained by hardware of the era. The famous fog served a practical purpose, masking geometry pop-in as well as setting the mood. The construction set shipped with the game. Players could modify everything. Total conversions appeared within months.
The construction set. Bethesda saw games as more than finished products. They became platforms for collective imagination. Within a year, players had created questlines surpassing the original game in scope, new continents to explore, complete mechanical overhauls.
Meanwhile, BioWare refined their formula. Knights of the Old Republic in 2003. Star Wars license, but the underlying system was modified D&D 3rd edition. Real-time combat with queuable actions. The morality system, light side, dark side, affected force powers, party interactions, even physical appearance.
But here's where Eastern design philosophy began to influence Western development. The companion characters, Bastila, HK-47, Jolie, moved beyond being mere statistical aids and became fully realized personalities with their own arcs, conflicts, and romance options. BioWare drew inspiration from Japanese dating sims and character-driven narratives. The late-game revelation about the player character's identity matched the boldness of any Final Fantasy twist.
The Xbox hardware enabled features impossible on previous consoles. Built-in hard drive meant faster loading, persistent save states. 733 MHz CPU and custom GPU handled real-time shadows, bump mapping. The game looked comparable to contemporary PC releases.
This technological convergence is crucial. Consoles gained hard drives and online connectivity, while PCs standardized around Windows and Direct3D. The platform wars became less about capability and more about philosophy. Japanese developers still prioritized guided experiences. Western developers championed player agency. But the boundaries blurred. Fable promised consequences for every action, Peter Molyneux's eternal oversell, but delivered something more modest, yet still revolutionary. A hero whose appearance reflected moral choices, a world that remembered your deeds.
The coding challenges multiplied. Save files ballooned. Morrowind saves could exceed 10 megabytes as they stored object positions for every moved item. Backwards compatibility became a concern. Patches required internet connections not everyone possessed. Digital distribution remained embryonic. Steam launched in 2003, but initially just delivered Valve games.
Yet amid this technical arms race, a quieter revolution percolated. Cave Story, crafted by Daisuke Amaya in his spare time over 5 years, released free in 2004. Not quite an RPG, but it carried the genetic markers, experience points, weapon upgrades, multiple endings. Created in C++ with custom tools, distributed through Japanese forums, and eventually fan-translated. Here was proof that a single developer with dedication could create something rivaling commercial productions. The barriers had fundamentally changed. You didn't need a publisher, a team, a budget. You needed time, skill, and most crucially, a vision distinct enough to matter. The indie revolution wouldn't explode until digital distribution matured, but its fuse was already lit, sparking in small forums and personal websites.
The tools kept improving. GameMaker emerged in 1999, evolving rapidly. RPG Maker XP in 2004 added Ruby scripting, enabling complex customization. Torque Game Engine offered professional 3D capabilities for $100. Open-source engines like Ogre provided free alternatives.
By the mid-2000s, the landscape had fractured into fascinating diversity. World of Warcraft conquered the MMO space through accessibility and polish. The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion pursued immersive simulation with fully voiced NPCs and physics-enabled cheese wheels. Dragon Quest VIII proved traditional JRPGs could still captivate with cel-shaded beauty. Mass Effect promised the fusion of shooter combat with branching galactic narrative. Each strand pulled the medium in different directions, yet they remained recognizably part of the same genetic family. The RPG had evolved from its dungeon-crawling origins into something magnificent and multifaceted, part movie, part novel, part simulation, part community. The stage was set for explosions, both big and small.
The PlayStation 2 had sold over 100 million units by this point. The next generation of consoles promised HD graphics, online integration, downloadable content. The infrastructure for Revolution was nearly complete.
Revolution, yes, but which one? The glossy corporate vision of games as service, content as commodity, or something stranger, more personal, games as expression, as argument, as art? The answer, deliciously, would be both. And then, in January 1997, everything changed. Not gradually, not incrementally, instantaneously. Final Fantasy VII arrived on PlayStation like a cultural asteroid impact, and the landscape of gaming would never be the same. Consider the audacity of it. Square, having mastered the intimate pixel-perfect artistry of the Super Nintendo, threw it all away. They abandoned Nintendo, their partner for a decade, and bet everything on Sony's unproven PlayStation. Why? Because compact discs offered something cartridges never could: space for dreams too large to compress. The numbers tell only part of the story. Yes, 650 megabytes dwarfed the 4 megabyte cartridges of yesteryear. Yes, the development team ballooned from 35 to over 100 people. Yes, the budget exploded to $45 million, more than many Hollywood films. But what those numbers enabled was a fundamental reimagining of what a game could be. Full-motion video sequences, orchestral scores recorded with real instruments, a world that felt genuinely cinematic in scope and ambition. But here's what fascinated me most. Final Fantasy VII's commercial success brought with it something even more significant: a brand new audience. People who had never touched an RPG suddenly found themselves weeping over Aerith's death. The game sold over 10 million copies, but more importantly, it gave the medium permission to be taken seriously as an art form.
The technical achievement can't be overstated. Real-time 3D character models moving through pre-rendered backgrounds, a hybrid approach that maximized visual fidelity while working within PlayStation's polygon limits.
Exactly. And that hybrid approach became the signature of the PlayStation RPG era. Square's competitors scrambled to match their formula, but what emerged wasn't mere imitation, it was an explosion of creative diversity that would have been impossible in the cartridge era. Take Konami's Suikoden series. The first game arrived quietly in 1996, but Suikoden 2 in 1998. Now there was ambition. 108 recruitable characters, each with their own subplot, political intrigue that would make Machiavelli proud, and choices, real choices, that determined whether characters lived or died, whether nations rose or fell. The game asked players to execute former friends, to choose between personal loyalty and political necessity. Heavy themes for a medium still fighting to be taken seriously. Square themselves couldn't stop experimenting. Xenogears in 1998 dared to deconstruct religion, psychology, and the nature of consciousness itself. The second disc famously ran out of development time and budget, reducing gameplay to characters sitting in chairs explaining plot points. Yet players forgave it because the story was that compelling. Where else but in this fevered PlayStation era could a half-finished game about Gnosticism and Jungian psychology become a cult classic?
The storage capacity enabled risks. Xenogears contained nearly 2 hours of animated cutscenes. Voice acting began appearing, though still sparingly due to localization costs.
And let's talk about those localizations. Ted Woolsey had perfected the art of compression on SNES, fitting elaborate Japanese scripts into tiny English text boxes. But CDs meant no more compression. Localizers could finally translate dialogue properly. Working Designs became legendary for their elaborate translations of games like Luna Silver Star Story Complete, adding humor, cultural references, even rewriting entire scenes to resonate with Western audiences. The variety was staggering. Atlas brought over the Persona series, which dared to set RPGs in modern-day high schools instead of fantasy kingdoms. Square experimented with Parasite Eve, blending RPG mechanics with survival horror, mitochondria as the enemy. Even racing games wanted to be RPGs. Sony's Gran Turismo had you earning licenses and upgrading cars like they were party members.
Saga Frontier pushed non-linearity to extremes. 7 different protagonists with interwoven stories. The game tracked hundreds of flags to determine which events triggered for which characters.
A glorious mess. Critics called it incomprehensible, but that was the point. The PlayStation era gave developers permission to fail spectacularly. Star Ocean, the second story, featured relationship systems so complex they generated over 80 different endings. Valkyrie Profile told its story backwards, with Norse mythology meeting existential dread. Vagrant Story proved that an RPG could succeed with exactly 1 playable character and 0 traditional party members. And through it all, Final Fantasy itself kept reinventing. 8 replaced traditional leveling with the controversial junction system. Enemies scaled with you. Magic became expendable items. Ike's returned to fantasy roots, but with a melancholy that permeated every pixel. Each game sold millions, proving that audiences hungered not for formula, but for innovation wrapped in spectacle.
The technical arms race accelerated. Each year brought improved graphics, larger worlds, more elaborate cutscenes. By 2000, games like Chrono Cross pushed the PlayStation beyond its intended limits.
Chrono Cross, the not-quite sequel that dared to question whether saving the world in Chrono Trigger had actually been the right thing to do. 45 playable characters, each with unique accents and speech patterns, a battle system based on color theory, a plot that required a philosophy degree to untangle. It sold well enough, but more importantly, it proved that even successful franchises could completely reimagine themselves. The PlayStation 2 arrived in 2000, and the boom only intensified. Final Fantasy X brought full voice acting, every line spoken aloud. Kingdom Hearts asked, "What if we put Donald Duck in an existential crisis about the nature of hearts and identity?" And somehow it worked. The budget and scope of these productions began rivaling television shows.
Development costs became unsustainable for smaller studios. The same technology that enabled these ambitious games also priced out competitors.
The seeds of the boom's end were planted in its very success. But for one glorious decade, Japanese RPGs ruled the world. They proved games could be art, that teenagers saving the world could carry the same emotional weight as any novel or film. Most importantly, they created an audience, millions of players who learned that games could make them cry, make them think, make them question everything. And while this cinematic revolution unfolded on home consoles, a different kind of revolution was brewing on tiny monochrome screens. Because in 1996, a modest game about catching creatures began its journey to becoming the highest-grossing media franchise in human history.
While PlayStation pushed RPGs towards cinematic spectacle, something radically different was happening on a 2.5-inch monochrome screen. In February 1996, Game Freak released Pokémon Red and Green in Japan for the original Game Boy, hardware from 1989, already considered ancient by gaming standards. The technical constraints were severe: 8 KB of RAM, a 4 MHz processor, 4 shades of gray. Yet within these limitations, Satoshi Tajiri had engineered something revolutionary. The core innovation wasn't graphical, it was systemic. Each Pokémon was essentially a data structure: species ID, individual values for stats, current level, moveset pointers. The genius lay in compression. With only 32 kilobytes of SRAM for save data, Game Freak managed to store not just your party of 6 Pokémon, but an entire PC storage system holding up to 240 creatures, each with unique stats. They achieved this through bit packing, cramming multiple values into single bytes, using lookup tables for species data rather than storing redundant information. But the real technical breakthrough was the link cable functionality. The Game Boy had shipped with a link port in 1989, mostly used for Tetris matches. Pokémon transformed this neglected feature into the cornerstone of a social revolution. Trading required synchronizing 2 Game Boys running at slightly different clock speeds, managing packet loss over a physical cable, ensuring data integrity so players didn't lose their precious creatures to corruption. The protocol they developed was remarkably robust. I've examined the assembly code, and it's elegant in its simplicity.
And that cable became a social lifeline. Suddenly, every school playground had kids huddled together, Game Boys connected by that grey wire, negotiating trades like tiny stockbrokers.
The multiplayer wasn't simply an add-on, it formed the backbone of the game's design. Version exclusivity meant you literally couldn't complete your Pokédex without trading. Red had Ekans, Blue had Sandshrew. Some Pokémon only evolved when traded. This wasn't possible on home consoles of the era. Local multiplayer required multiple controllers, multiple TVs. But Game Boys? Every kid had their own screen, their own save file, their own personal collection they carried in their pocket. The battle system was deceptively sophisticated. Type matchups created a 15 by 15 matrix of multipliers. Water beats fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water, but then psychic dominates poison, ground is immune to electric. Each Pokémon could learn 4 moves from a pool specific to their species, creating billions of possible team combinations. The stat system included hidden effort values and individual values that made each Pokémon subtly unique. 2 Pikachus could have different stat distributions even at the same level. What really impressed me was the pseudo-random number generator. With limited processing power, they needed efficient randomness for critical hits, status effects, and counter rates. They used a linear feedback shift register, a beautiful algorithm that generates seemingly random numbers through bit manipulation. Every frame, the RNG advanced, making battles unpredictable, yet deterministic enough for the hardware.
You're describing the DNA of an empire. By 1999, when Red and Blue reached North America, selling games was only part of the story. They launched an entire ecosystem: the anime, the trading cards, the merchandise.
The franchise architecture was unprecedented. Each medium reinforced the others. The anime taught game mechanics, type advantages demonstrated through Ash's battles. The trading card game provided a physical analog to the digital collection. Even the merchandise served a function. A Pikachu plushie was a totem of membership in this new culture. Nintendo's localization deserves credit too. The original Japanese versions had numerous bugs, including the infamous missing no glitch that could corrupt save data. For the international release, they fixed most game-breaking bugs while preserving harmless ones that had become part of the culture. They increased the sprite quality, improved the translation to avoid the space constraints that plagued other RPG localizations.
Speaking of missing no, has any glitch ever achieved such mythological status? This corrupted data that manifested as a Pokémon, duplicating items, breaking the game's economy.
Missing no resulted from how the game stored encounter data. The Old Man tutorial in Viridian City temporarily overwrote the player's name data with demonstration values. Flying to Cinnabar Island immediately after meant the game read this corrupted data as encounter tables for the Eastern Shore, a shore that normally had no encounters. The result, impossible Pokémon IDs that the game tried to interpret, creating visual corruption and the legendary item duplication glitch. What's remarkable is that Game Freak's code was robust enough that encountering missing no rarely caused permanent damage. The game could handle these edge cases without completely crashing, a testament to defensive programming on limited hardware.
And players didn't avoid it. They sought it out. Missing no became digital folklore, shared through playground whispers and early internet forums. How many games turn their bugs into mythology?
By 2001, Gold and Silver pushed the Game Boy Color to its absolute limits. 16,000 colors to work with instead of 4 shades of gray. They added a real-time clock. The game tracked actual time, with different Pokémon appearing during day or night. They implemented breeding systems with inherited moves and stats, creating a genetic algorithm that players could manipulate. Most impressively, they included the entire Kanto region from the first games as post-game content, essentially fitting 2 complete RPGs into a single cartridge through aggressive compression and clever data reuse. The competitive scene emerged organically. Players discovered that beneath the child-friendly surface lay a system deep enough for serious strategic play. Hidden stats, move priorities, switching predictions. What began as a children's game evolved into something comparable to chess in complexity. Nintendo eventually embraced this with official tournaments, legitimizing what players had created themselves.
A game about friendship and collection became a crucible for cold mathematical optimization. The same kids trading Butterfrees at recess grew up to calculate damage formulas and breed for perfect IV spreads.
The technical influence extends far beyond monster collection games. Pokémon proved that handheld gaming could support deep, system-driven experiences. It demonstrated that social features, not graphics, could drive adoption. The save system's robustness influenced how portable games handled data. The compression techniques became standard practice for Game Boy development. Modern indies still reference these lessons. When Temtem implemented online monster collection, they studied Pokémon's trade protocols. When Cassette Beasts designed type matchups, they analyzed why Pokémon's rock-paper-scissors system felt intuitive. Even games outside the genre learned from Pokémon's approach to tutorial design. Professor Oak's laboratory taught complex systems without feeling like instruction.
You know what strikes me most? While Final Fantasy VII was recruiting Hollywood composers and rendering cinematic cutscenes, Pokémon conquered the world with beeps and boops. Junichi Masuda's soundtrack, those melodies programmed note by note in assembly language.
4 audio channels. That's all the Game Boy provided. 2 square waves, 1 programmable wave, 1 noise channel. Every town theme, every battle fanfare, every victory jingle had to fit within those constraints. Masuda created leitmotifs that could be recognized in 4 notes. The rival's theme, the gym leader battle, the championship road, melodies so iconic they're still remixed and orchestrated today. By 2002, Ruby and Sapphire on Game Boy Advance introduced abilities, natures, double battles, layers of complexity that kept pace with the aging audience while remaining accessible to newcomers. The franchise had achieved something unprecedented, a game that 8-year-olds could enjoy catching Pikachu in, while 20-somethings calculated effort value spreads for competitive play.
A universe where everyone could find their level of engagement. Casual collectors, competitive battlers, shiny hunters, spending thousands of hours for different colored sprites.
The legacy is staggering. Pokémon created a new genre and template for multimedia success that everyone from Yokai Watch to Skylanders would attempt to replicate. It proved that RPGs could be social experiences, that portability mattered more than processing power, that collection and customization were universal human drives. As we entered the 2000s, Pokémon had generated more revenue than Star Wars. A game born from one developer's childhood bug-collecting hobby had become the highest-grossing media franchise in human history. And while it conquered the mainstream through accessibility, something different was stirring in the underground. Developers with RPG Maker and Game Maker were learning they didn't need publishers, didn't need cartridges, didn't need anything but passion and an internet connection.
The tools of creation were about to be democratized, and when they were, a generation raised on Pokémon and Final Fantasy would transform independent development forever. The year is 2000. While Square pours $45 million into Final Fantasy IX and Nintendo prints money with Pokémon Gold and Silver, something quietly revolutionary is happening in bedrooms and basements around the world. ASCII Corporation releases RPG Maker 2000 to the West. Suddenly, the sacred art of RPG creation, once requiring teams of programmers, artists, composers, becomes accessible to anyone with a PC and a dream.
The technical breakthrough wasn't the engine itself. RPG Maker's Ruby-based scripting existed since the early 90s in Japan. What changed was accessibility. The interface abstracted away the complexity. Tile-based map editors, event systems using visual scripting, pre-made assets covering everything from character sprites to battle backgrounds. You could create a functional RPG without writing a single line of code.
And here's where it gets philosophically fascinating. The same year Squaresoft needs 130 people to ship Final Fantasy IX, a Japanese developer known only as Kikiyama begins work on Yume Nikki in RPG Maker 2003. No team, no budget, no publisher, just one person exploring the outer boundaries of what an RPG could be. A game about dreams and nightmares, where combat doesn't exist, and the only goal is to explore surreal landscapes of the subconscious. By 2004, when Kikiyama uploads it to the internet for free, it becomes an underground legend. Not through marketing campaigns or retail distribution, but through forum posts and word of mouth. The cultural shift was seismic. RPG creation transformed from an industrial process to a form of personal expression. Like punk rock democratizing music or camcorders democratizing film, RPG Maker turned game development into an accessible art form.
The technical constraints of RPG Maker actually fostered creativity, limited to 640 by 480 resolution, restricted to MIDI music, fixed tile sizes of 16 by 16 pixels. These limitations forced developers to innovate within boundaries. When you can't compete on graphics, you focus on narrative. When you can't create sprawling worlds, you create density of meaning.
Consider Off, released in 2008 by a Belgian developer called Mortis Ghost. Created entirely in RPG Maker 2003, it presents a world where you play as the Batter, purifying zones of spectral corruption. Except the purification process destroys everything, leaving behind only empty void. The game interrogates the player's complicity in following orders, in trusting the heroic narrative. All achieved with default RPG Maker assets twisted into something deeply unsettling. These weren't games trying to mimic commercial releases. They were using the medium to explore ideas that no publisher would touch: mental illness, existential horror, meta-commentary on player agency. The barrier between thought and creation had dissolved.
Parallel to RPG Maker, Mark Overmars releases Game Maker in 1999. Written in Delphi, it takes a different approach: drag-and-drop visual programming with GML scripting for advanced users. While RPG Maker specialized in JRPGs, Game Maker was genre-agnostic. Its event-driven architecture and built-in physics made it ideal for action games, platformers, anything requiring real-time movement. By 2007, Yo-Yo Games acquires Game Maker and begins aggressive development. The engine gains cross-platform compilation, allowing developers to export to Windows, Mac, and eventually mobile devices from a single codebase. This technical capability would prove crucial for the next generation of indie developers.
The tools were one half of the revolution. The other half was distribution. For decades, getting your game to players meant convincing a publisher, manufacturing physical media, negotiating with retailers. In 2003, Valve launches Steam. Initially just a patching system for Counter-Strike, it evolves into a digital storefront. By 2005, third-party games appear. By 2008, the floodgates open. Suddenly, a developer in São Paulo could sell directly to a player in Stockholm. No middleman, no regional restrictions, no inventory risk. The economic model of game development inverted overnight.
The technical infrastructure Steam provided was revolutionary. Automatic patching meant developers could fix bugs post-launch. Cloud saves meant players could switch computers without losing progress. But the real innovation was the SDK. Steam's API allowed deep integration. Achievements, leaderboards, multiplayer matchmaking, features that once required massive back-end infrastructure became simple function calls. Steam's recommendation algorithm also changed discoverability. Instead of shelf space determining visibility, player behavior drove recommendations. If you enjoyed cavernous exploration in Cave Story, Steam might suggest La Mulana. If you spent hours in RPG Maker games, it learned your tastes. The long tail of gaming suddenly became navigable.
And in this fertile soil, a new generation of developers began to sprout. Take Daisuke Amaya, creating Cave Story over 5 years in his spare time. Released for free in 2004, it spreads through the nascent indie community like wildfire. A Metroidvania with precise controls, memorable music, multiple endings based on player choices. When it finally gets commercial release years later, it influences an entire generation of indie developers. Proof that one person with dedication could create something rivaling, even surpassing, commercial releases. Or witness Jeff Vogel of Spiderweb Software, stubbornly crafting isometric RPGs since 1994. While the industry chased photorealism, he maintained purposefully primitive graphics, focusing instead on deep systems and branching narratives. Genforge, Avernum, Avedon, each series iterating on classic CRPG design. His games looked like they could have existed in 1995, and that was precisely the point. He found an audience that valued depth over polish, complexity over accessibility. By staying small, staying focused, he sustained a 20-year career while studios 100 times his size collapsed.
The technical democratization extended beyond engines. Art tools became accessible. Graphic scale for pixel art released as freeware. FL Studio democratized music production, letting bedroom composers create soundtracks rivaling studio productions. Version control systems like SVN and later Git meant distributed teams could collaborate without expensive infrastructure. The entire production pipeline that once required specialized hardware and software became available for free or minimal cost.
By 2009, the seeds planted throughout the decade begin to flower spectacularly. Minecraft, initially a solo project by Marcus Persson, demonstrates that an indie game could become a cultural phenomenon surpassing most AAA releases. Kickstarter launches, providing a funding mechanism that bypasses traditional publishers entirely. Suddenly, developers could pitch directly to players, secure funding based on concepts rather than completed products. The same year, a teenager named Toby Fox joins the Starman.net forums, an EarthBound fan community. He begins creating ROM hacks, learning how RPGs function at the code level, absorbing lessons from a commercial failure that became a cult masterpiece. In a few years, he'll take everything he learned, from EarthBound's emotional resonance, from RPG Maker experimentation, from bullet hell games, from forum community feedback, and synthesize it into something unprecedented.
The decade ends with all pieces in place. Accessible engines lowering technical barriers, digital distribution eliminating publishing gatekeepers, communities forming around creation tools, sharing knowledge and assets, crowdfunding providing alternative financing, social media enabling direct creator-to-player communication. The indie revolution wasn't a single breakthrough, but a convergence of technologies and cultural shifts. By 2010, creating an RPG no longer requires industry connections or venture capital. It requires only vision, dedication, and internet access. The means of production have been thoroughly democratized. What happens next will transform not just indie gaming, but the entire medium's understanding of what RPGs can be.
The revolution was complete. Now came the Renaissance.
The technical infrastructure was complete. Engines democratized, distribution decentralized, communities connected. What emerged from this fertile digital soil between 2010 and 2015 fundamentally rewired our understanding of what an RPG could achieve with minimal resources. The Renaissance didn't announce itself with marketing campaigns or E3 presentations. It crept through Steam's recommendation algorithms, spread across YouTube Let's Plays, and exploded through social media word of mouth. Consider the numbers. In 2010, Steam hosted approximately 200 indie games total. By 2015, that number exceeded 4,000. The exponential growth created both opportunity and challenge. Discoverability became the new bottleneck. But for those who broke through, the rewards were astronomical. Cave Story, after 6 years of obscurity, suddenly found commercial success through digital distribution. Braid proved puzzle platformers could carry philosophical weight. But RPGs? The genre seemed too complex, too time-intensive for solo developers to tackle seriously. Then came the paradigm shifts. In 2011, Zeboyd Games, literally 2 people, released Cthulhu Saves the World, a loving JRPG parody that proved you could create a full-length RPG on a shoestring budget. Built in XNA, Microsoft's now defunct framework, it featured branching skill trees, multiple party members, and dozens of hours of content. Total development cost approximately $3,000. First week sales, 30,000 copies. The economics had inverted completely from the PlayStation era's multi-million-dollar productions.
But here's where it transcends mere economics. What emerges goes far beyond simply lowering production costs. It represents a fundamental reimagining of the medium's possibilities.
Precisely. The technical constraints that might have seemed limiting became creative catalysts. Take Dreadmore, Dungeons of Dreadmore, released in 2011 by Gaslamp Games. 3 developers creating a roguelike with procedural generation, permadeath, and crafting systems so absurdly complex they bordered on parody. Skills like vampire archaeology and communist crafting. The entire game ran on a custom C++ engine, eschewing popular frameworks entirely. Why? Because they wanted pixel-perfect control over their satirical vision. It sold over 500,000 copies, proving appetite existed for RPGs that actively mocked genre conventions while simultaneously perfecting them. But the real technical revolution was happening in GameMaker Studios' evolution. Version 1.0, released in 2012, added native compilation for multiple platforms. Suddenly, a game developed on Windows could export to Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, all from the same codebase. The implications were staggering. A solo developer could now reach every major platform without learning platform-specific languages or managing multiple codebases. Meanwhile, Unity was transforming from a 3D engine into an all-purpose game development platform. Its asset store launched in 2010, creating a marketplace where developers could purchase everything from character controllers to entire RPG frameworks. The technical barrier practically evaporated. You could prototype an RPG in days rather than months.
Yet what fascinates me is how this technological democratization coincided with a creative awakening, as if the medium had been waiting for these constraints to lift before revealing its true potential.
The convergence was remarkable. In 2012, FTL Faster Than Light emerged from a two-person team, funded through Kickstarter. Not traditionally an RPG, but it borrowed progression systems, permadeath, and narrative choice mechanics. Its success, over 200,000 copies in 6 months, demonstrated hunger for genre-blending experiences. The same year, Legend of Grimrock proved first-person dungeon crawlers could thrive in the modern era, selling 600,000 copies with just 4 developers. 2013 became a watershed year. Papers, Please, again, not purely an RPG, but incorporating role-playing elements of moral choice and consequence, won the Independent Games Festival Grand Prize. Gone Home told environmental stories through exploration. The Stanley Parable deconstructed player agency itself. Each success expanded the definition of what independent games could achieve narratively and mechanically. The technical tools kept pace. GameMaker Studio 2 entered development. Unity 4 added mechanism animation systems, making character animation accessible to non-specialists. Unreal Engine 4 announced it would go free to use with a 5% royalty model. Even AAA-grade engines became democratized. The playing field had transformed into something unrecognizable from a decade prior.
And into this maelstrom of possibility steps a young developer who'd spent years absorbing EarthBound's lessons through ROM hacking.
Toby Fox. But before we reach Undertale's seismic impact, consider the ecosystem that made it possible. By 2014, Twitch streaming had transformed game discovery. A single influential streamer could catapult an unknown indie game to viral status overnight. YouTube lets players like PewDiePie commanded audiences larger than television networks. Social media, particularly Twitter and Tumblr, created direct pipelines between creators and fans. The traditional media gatekeepers had been entirely circumvented. Crowdfunding matured beyond initial enthusiasm into a sustainable funding model. Shovel Knight raised $300,000 on Kickstarter in 2013, delivering a pitch-perfect retro platformer that proved nostalgic experiences could feel fresh when executed with modern sensibilities. Pillars of Eternity raised nearly $4 million in 2012, demonstrating appetite for classic CRPG experiences publishers had declared dead. The stage was set, tools accessible, distribution open, funding available, communities eager. All that remained was for someone to synthesize these elements into something that would redefine what a solo developer could achieve. The Renaissance had begun. Its crown jewel was about to emerge from a most unexpected source. A Kickstarter campaign asking for just $5,000 to complete a quirky RPG where nobody has to die.
$5,000, less than the catering budget for a single day of AAA development. And yet, $5,000. That's what Toby Fox asked for on Kickstarter in June 2013. A demo, some concept art, a promise that you could complete an RPG without killing anyone. Within a month, backers had pledged $51,000, 10 times the goal. Not because of marketing wizardry or industry connections, but because that demo contained something ineffable, a spark. Players could feel it. This wasn't just another nostalgia-mining indie RPG. This was someone deconstructing the entire genre's moral assumptions while simultaneously perfecting its emotional core. The journey to that Kickstarter began years earlier in the EarthBound fan community. Toby Fox, known then as Radiation, created ROM hacks that displayed both technical proficiency and narrative ambition. His EarthBound Halloween hack, created when he was 16, featured mature themes and meta-commentary that foreshadowed Undertale's approach. But more importantly, it revealed someone who understood games as emotional experiences, someone who'd internalized EarthBound's lesson that RPGs could be personal, funny, and devastating in equal measure. When Fox began Undertale's development in earnest, he made a crucial technical decision. GameMaker Studio, not Unity, not a custom engine. GameMaker, the same tool dismissed by many as suitable only for simple platformers. But Fox understood something others missed. GameMaker's limitations would force focus. Its 2D sprite handling was robust. Its scripting language, GML, was approachable yet powerful enough for complex systems. Most critically, it allowed rapid iteration. Fox could test ideas, discard what didn't work, refine what did. The engine became invisible, letting the design shine through.
The combat system alone justified that choice. Hybrid mechanics are notoriously difficult to balance, yet Fox created something elegantly simple that felt revolutionary.
Revolutionary precisely because it interrogated the fundamental assumption of RPG combat, that violence is inevitable. Every enemy in Undertale can be spared, not through a simple mercy button, but through understanding them. The Frogget needs compliments, the Moldsmaw wants to be ignored. Each creature has unique sacked options that reveal personality, transform them from obstacles into characters. The genius lies in making pacifism require more engagement than violence. Attacking is always simpler. One button, watch numbers, decrease. Mercy demands observation, experimentation, empathy. But here's where Undertale transcends clever mechanics. The game remembers. Kill a creature, and its friends might comment on its absence. Reload a save to undo your actions, and certain characters acknowledge the temporal manipulation. The game's memory persists across playthroughs, files, even reinstallation. Fox implemented what he called dirty hacker tricks, writing to obscure registry keys and hidden folders. To maintain this persistence, your choices were etched into your computer's soul. This technical audacity served a narrative purpose. Undertale isn't merely about choosing pacifism or genocide, it's about confronting the player's relationship with choice itself. Why do we kill in games? Because the game allows it. Because we're curious about the content locked behind violence. Undertale makes those questions explicit, uncomfortable. The genocide route, where you systematically hunt down every creature, transforms the game into psychological horror. Music slows, characters flee, the underground empties, and the game judges you, not through moralizing dialogue, but through mechanical punishment. Encounters become rare. You spend minutes walking through empty rooms, searching for victims. Boredom becomes moral commentary.
The technical implementation of these routes required extraordinary planning. 3 distinct narrative paths, each with unique dialogue, encounters, and even gameplay mechanics.
Consider the final boss encounters. In the pacifist route, you face Azrael, a godlike being whose attacks fill the entire screen with bullet patterns inspired by Toho shooters. Fox pushed GameMaker to its limits, creating visually spectacular sequences that felt impossible for the engine. Your HP drops to fractions, but determination, literally manifested as refusing to die, keeps you alive. It's mechanically representing the power of hope, of refusing to give up. Contrast with Sans in the genocide route. The laziest character becomes the hardest boss, breaking every rule the game established. He attacks first, he ignores invincibility frames. He manipulates the battle box, slamming you against walls. His patterns require frame-perfect precision. Players reported spending hours, days, even weeks learning his attacks. And why? To complete their genocide, to see the ending. Sans knows this. His dialogue acknowledges you're probably watching a video to learn his patterns. He knows he can't truly stop you. You'll keep loading saves until you win. His only victory is making the process miserable enough that maybe, just maybe, you'll give up. The music, entirely composed by Fox, became instrumental to Undertale's emotional impact. Not through orchestral complexity, but through leitmotif mastery. Themes recur, transform, recontextualize. His theme appears in multiple tracks, each iteration revealing new emotional dimensions. The shop theme shares DNA with the final boss music. Every track connects, creating a musical web that reinforces the game's themes of connection and consequence. When Fox couldn't find the right sound font for Megalovania, Sans' battle theme, he sampled his own older version from the EarthBound hack, bringing his creative journey full circle.
The game's release on September 15, 2015, coincided perfectly with the streaming and social media ecosystem we discussed. Within days, Let's Players were broadcasting their journeys. The game seemed designed for this.
Because Fox understood something profound about modern game consumption. Players perform, share, discuss. Undertale's multiple routes created natural conversation. Streamers who chose genocide faced chat rooms pleading for mercy. Those who went pacifist received encouragement. The game's best moments, Sans' puns, Papyrus's spaghetti obsession, the True Lab's horror, became shareable cultural touchstones. Tumblr exploded with fan art. Twitter threads dissected every secret. The game achieved what marketing millions couldn't: organic, passionate community growth. Critical reception was unanimous. Metacritic scores approaching perfection. Overwhelmingly positive Steam reviews. But more telling were the personal responses, players describing crying at the true pacifist ending, others unable to complete genocide runs, stopped by genuine guilt. Fox received messages from players saying Undertale helped them through depression, taught them empathy, changed their perspective on conflict resolution. A silly RPG about underground monsters had achieved something profound. Commercially, Undertale shattered every expectation. 5 million copies sold, ports to every platform, merchandise, concerts, even Mii costumes in Super Smash Bros. Fox went from unknown developer to industry figure, invited to compose music for Game Freak's Pokémon series, the student surpassing masters. But perhaps most significantly, Undertale inspired a generation of developers. Suddenly, everyone understood. You didn't need teams, budgets, or cutting-edge graphics. You needed vision, dedication, and something to say.
The technical influence is measurable. Post-Undertale, Steam saw an explosion of meta-narrative indie RPGs, games examining player agency, subverting genre expectations, implementing permanent consequences.
Yet none quite captured Undertale's magic, because they copied its techniques without understanding its heart. Undertale succeeded not through cleverness alone, but through genuine emotion. Fox created characters players loved, then asked them to consider what that love meant. Were you playing pacifist because you cared, or because you wanted the good ending? Was your mercy genuine or performative? These questions resonated because they extended beyond the game into how we engage with all media, all choices. In the end, Undertale proved that the renaissance we'd been discussing wasn't only about democratized tools or new distribution methods. It was about games finally achieving their potential as the defining artistic medium of the 21st century. Interactive, personal, capable of creating experiences impossible in any other form. $5,000. One person. Infinite determination. The underground's barrier had been shattered. The surface world would never be the same.
Speaking of determination to create expansive worlds, Fox's next project would demonstrate that Undertale was no fluke. 3 years after Undertale, Toby Fox dropped Chapter 1 of Deltarune with zero announcement. Halloween 2018. No marketing campaign, no Kickstarter, no build-up. Just a tweet. Here's a game I made. Within 24 hours, it had been downloaded over 1 million times. But this wasn't Undertale 2. Fox had learned something crucial from his first success. The weight of expectations could crush creativity. So he built something parallel. Same DNA, different organism. Technically, Deltarune represented significant evolution. Where Undertale was a solo endeavor in GameMaker Studio, Deltarune required infrastructure for episodic release. Fox discovered GameMaker wasn't designed for modular chapter releases with persistent save data. The engine literally couldn't handle transferring complex game states between separately compiled executables. This forced a collaboration with Yo-Yo Games themselves to implement new functionality. They had to architect systems for save file compatibility across future chapters, variable namespace management to prevent conflicts, and graceful handling of missing chapter data. The scope expansion is measurable. Undertale had roughly 100 unique sprites. Deltarune Chapter 1 alone had over 300. The bullet patterns, previously confined to a small box, now utilized full-screen choreography. Party mechanics meant managing three characters' actions, equipment, and progression paths. Fox brought in a small team, artists like Temi Chang, programmers to handle the increased complexity. But he maintained iron control over the core vision, writing every line of dialogue, composing every track, designing every encounter personally.
Yet what fascinates
The save system provides clues. In Undertale, your save file was Kara, or whatever you named the fallen human. In Deltarune, you name yourself, but you're told explicitly, no one can choose who they are in this world. Your choices, that sacred mechanic from Undertale, are immediately questioned. You're playing as Chris, not as yourself. The game acknowledges your presence as a separate entity from the protagonist, a possession rather than an avatar. Chapter 2's release in 2021 expanded this theme. More party members, more elaborate set pieces, but also more instances where your agency is subtly undermined. You can make choices, but Chris might resist them. The ACE-T system returns, but outcomes feel more predetermined. Where Undertale asked, "What will you do with your power?" Deltarune asks, "What if you have no power at all?"
There's something deliciously perverse about Fox's approach here. After creating a game celebrating player agency, he crafts one questioning whether that agency ever existed. Were you really choosing mercy in Undertale, or were you following the path Fox laid out, decorated with the illusion of choice?
Development transparency increased significantly with Deltarune. Fox publishes status updates, explains technical hurdles, manages expectations. He announced chapters 3 and 4 would release together, learning from the awkward pacing of separate chapter releases, though chapter 5 would come later. His 2022 update revealed they'd implemented a new animation system, allowing more complex cutscenes without hiring a full animation team. They built custom tools for managing dialogue trees across chapters, preventing continuity errors in a branching narrative spanning multiple releases. The music production evolved too. Where Undertale's soundtrack was purely Fox working in FL Studio, Deltarune incorporates live instruments, guest musicians, more sophisticated arrangements. Attack of the Killer Queen, from Chapter 2, layers multiple musical themes in ways that would have been technically unfeasible in Undertale's simpler audio system. Fox collaborates with musicians like Laura Shigihara, expanding his sonic palette while maintaining his distinctive leitmotif-heavy style.
The community response has been, patient isn't quite the word. Devoted, 3 years between Chapter 1 and 2, and nearly 4 years until Chapters 3 and 4's scheduled release in June 2025. In any other context, this development pace would kill momentum. But Fox cultivated something rare: trust. Fans wait because they believe the wait has purpose. Each chapter feels deliberately crafted rather than rushed to market. The initial free release model helped build goodwill, though the upcoming chapters will be priced at $24.99 for the complete package.
The technical reasoning is sound. Deltarune's architecture requires all chapters to be essentially complete before releasing the middle ones. You can't retroactively patch Chapter 3 if Chapter 5's events require different flag states. Every variable, every potential story branch must be mapped across the entire narrative. It's like building a house of cards, where you need all cards in place before revealing any section.
Which brings us to the fascinating paradox of modern indie development. Fox has resources now, money from Undertale's success, industry connections, a willing team. Yet Deltarune takes longer to develop than Undertale did. Success breeds complexity. Where once he could change anything on a whim, now there are translators to coordinate, ports to consider, team members to manage. The Chapter 2 credits list over 100 people when including localization. The scrappy solo developer became, almost against his will, a director.
But he's managing it strategically. The team remains small for core development. Fox still personally codes key systems, writes all dialogue, composes all music. He learned from other indies who scaled too fast and lost their creative vision. Deltarune feels handcrafted because it largely is, just with more hands helping with implementation rather than design.
And perhaps that's Deltarune's greatest achievement, proving that the indie ethos can survive success. that you can grow without becoming corporate, that taking 7 years to release a game is acceptable if those 7 years are spent perfecting rather than padding. In an industry obsessed with annual releases and perpetual content, Deltarune stands as a monument to patience, both from its creator and its audience.
The wait finally has an end date. On Halloween 2024, 6 years after Chapter 1's surprise drop, Fox confirmed Chapters 3 and 4 would 100% release in 2025. Then came the bombshell, June 5, 2025, announced during the Nintendo Switch 2 reveal. Deltarune would be a launch title for Nintendo's new console, releasing simultaneously across PC, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, and both Switch generations, a far cry from the staggered platform releases of earlier chapters.
The development updates from 2024 painted a picture of meticulous polish. By July, Chapter 4 was basically playable minus some polish. By October, they'd met internal deadlines for main content. December brought news that bug testing and localization were the primary hurdles, less glamorous work, but crucial for Fox's vision of a simultaneous worldwide release. The team even discovered that save file transfers from the demo to the full game had only recently become possible on consoles, requiring additional testing.
And while Chapters 3 and 4 enter their final phases, Chapter 5 development has already begun. Team members not occupied with localization or console porting have shifted focus to the next installment. Fox described progress as steady, measured optimism from someone who's learned the weight of overpromising. No timeline yet, but the infrastructure built for Chapters 3 and 4 should theoretically accelerate future development.
There's poetry in Deltarune, becoming a Switch 2 launch title. Undertale helped define the Switch's indie library at its own launch. Now its successor, or whatever metaphysical relationship these games share, helps usher in new hardware, from surprise Halloween drop to choreographed console launch, from solo developer to orchestrating simultaneous global releases. The scope expands, but Fox maintains his grip on the core creative vision.
Speaking of creative visions evolving while staying true to their roots, Deltarune wasn't the only indie RPG building on EarthBound's legacy while pushing in radically different directions.
Undertale's success did more than inspire imitators. It redrew the boundaries of what was possible in RPG design. While Toby Fox was methodically crafting Deltarune, a whole generation of developers was taking the lessons of emotional vulnerability, mechanical subversion, and authorial voice in radically different directions. Take Lisa, the Painful, which actually predated Undertale by a year but found its audience in that same cultural moment. Austin Jorgensen, working under the name Dingaling, created something that feels like the shadow self of the indie RPG renaissance, a post-apocalyptic nightmare about toxic masculinity, addiction, and the cycles of abuse. Where Undertale asked, "What if you didn't have to fight?" Lisa asked, "What if violence leaves scars that never heal?" The game's willingness to make players genuinely uncomfortable, forcing choices between party members' lives, permanently maiming the protagonist, creating situations with no good outcomes, pushed against the very idea of power fantasy that RPGs traditionally offer. The technical achievement here wasn't flashy innovation, but emotional precision. Jorgensen used RPG Maker VX Ace not to overcome its limitations, but to weaponize them. The janky movement, the crude sprites, the harsh soundscape, they all reinforced the game's thesis about a broken world full of broken people. The combat system's emphasis on combo timing and the infamous joy addiction mechanic that makes battles easier while slowly destroying your character created ludonarrative harmony through player complicity.
RPG Maker VX Ace's Ruby-based scripting.
Right, RGSS 3, Ruby Game Scripting System 3. What's fascinating is how Jorgensen pushed against its boundaries while staying mostly within them. The combo system required frame-perfect timing scripts layered on top of the default battle system. The permanent stat changes from dismemberment or joy addiction meant rewriting how the engine handled character data persistence. But the real technical achievement was the save system manipulation. The game tracks every cruel choice across multiple playthroughs, building a meta-narrative about cycles of violence that persist beyond individual runs. This approach influenced Omori in profound ways. though Omokat's team took 4 years of development in a completely different aesthetic direction. Where Lisa was grimy and confrontational, Omori wrapped its trauma in pastel dreamscapes and cute character designs, making its gut punches land even harder. The game began development in 2014, right in that RPG Maker renaissance period, but its scope kept expanding as the team's ambitions grew.
The Kickstarter raised $203,000, 6 years to release.
And that delay tells its own story about indie development evolution. Omori started in RPG Maker VX Ace like Lisa, but midway through development, the team ported everything to RPG Maker MV for its JavaScript foundation and better multi-platform support. That migration alone took months. Every custom script, every plugin, every carefully crafted visual effect had to be rebuilt. But it enabled something crucial: the seamless transitions between the vibrant dream world of Headspace and the muted reality of Faraway Town. The technical ambition here was staggering for an RPG Maker game. Custom lighting engines that shift based on emotional states, a battle system where team dynamics affect available skills, the follow-up mechanic that chains attacks based on emotional states, the infamous something sequences that layer disturbing imagery through particle effects and sprite distortion. They pushed RPG Maker MV so far that optimization became a constant battle. Players still report frame drops during the more elaborate dream sequences, but somehow that instability adds to the unreality. What Omori understood from Undertale wasn't just about subverting violence, it was about using every element of the game to reinforce emotional experience. The way the menu UI gradually corrupts as trauma resurfaces. The photo album that serves as both collectible and psychological torture device. The red space sequences that literally break the game's established visual language. 6 years of development created something that transcends its engine through sheer artistic determination.
Then Disco Elysium, no combat at all.
Ah, the great refusal. ZAUM's masterpiece took the RPG evolution to its logical conclusion. What if we removed combat entirely and made dialogue the everything? Built in Unity rather than RPG Maker, it had the technical freedom to completely reimagine what an RPG could be. But here's the thing. That freedom came with its own constraints. The team was mostly writers and artists, not programmers. They had to build their entire dialogue system from scratch, creating what amounts to a 1.2 million word novel that responds dynamically to dozens of skill checks. The thought cabinet system alone required months of implementation. How do you represent ideological development mechanically? Their solution, treating thoughts as equipment that modify your stats and dialogue options over time, created gameplay from pure conceptual internalization. The way your skills actively argue with you, the way failed checks can be more interesting than successes, the way the game makes you fail forward through sheer narrative momentum, its systems design as literature.
24 skills, each with unique dialogue trees.
And each one is essentially a different narrator with its own personality. Encyclopedia won't shut up about irrelevant facts. Electrochemistry demands drugs. Physical instrument wants to punch everything. The technical challenge was managing this chorus of voices. When does Inland Empire interject with surreal observations? How does high empathy change your perception of NPCs? They built a priority system where skills compete for attention based on stat levels and situational triggers. The result feels like having a constantly arguing brain, which is exactly what they wanted. The art pipeline deserves recognition too. The painterly aesthetic emerged directly from necessity. Unable to afford traditional animation, the team devised a method of layering and parallaxing static paintings to create depth, character portraits that shift subtly based on conversation flow, environmental details that emerge as your perception improves. The whole game runs on smoke and mirrors that somehow feel more real than photorealism. But perhaps Disco Elysium's greatest achievement was proving that RPG as a genre had become almost infinitely elastic. No combat? Still an RPG. No fantasy setting? Still an RPG. No power progression in traditional terms? Still unmistakably an RPG. It's about character development through choice, and everything else is negotiable.
Market reception varied wildly. Cult hit. Eventual success. Disco, critical darling, then millions sold.
The paths to success became as varied as the games themselves. Lisa found its audience through word-of-mouth horror, people sharing their discomfort, comparing cruel choices, arguing about interpretations. Omori's long development created a devoted community before release, following every update, creating fan content for 6 years. Disco Elysium started as critical homework, you should play this important game, before word spread that it was also hilarious, heartbreaking, and unlike anything else. Each proved different sustainability models too. Jorgensen followed Lisa with 2 more games in the series, each exploring different aspects of its broken world. Omori's success let Omocat expand into publishing, supporting other indie developers. ZAUM. Well, their implosion over creative control and capital is its own cautionary tale about what happens when art meets money. The indie dream doesn't always survive success.
Common thread: emotional honesty over mechanical innovation.
Precisely. These games succeed not through technical wizardry, but through using whatever tools necessary to achieve emotional impact. They're confessionals disguised as entertainment, therapy sessions with save points. They trust players to engage with difficult subjects, trauma, addiction, political failure, suicidal ideation, without providing easy answers or power fantasies as escape. They're the grown-up promise of what video games could become, a medium as capable of exploring human complexity as any literature or film, but with the unique property of complicity through interaction. And they opened floodgates. Suddenly, everyone realized you could make an RPG about anything, with any tools, with any budget, as long as you had something genuine to say and the persistence to say it. The genre had been democratized not both technologically and conceptually. The only limit was imagination and endurance.
While the indie revolution was democratizing RPG development, the AAA space was pushing technical boundaries in entirely different directions. The Witcher 3 stands as perhaps the most instructive case study. CD Projekt Red's journey from Polish localizers to creating one of the most technically ambitious RPGs ever made reveals both the possibilities and costs of modern AAA development. Consider the numbers. The Witcher 3's development team peaked at 250 people, with an additional 1,500 involved worldwide through outsourcing and localization. The budget exceeded $81 million. The game shipped with 450,000 lines of dialogue. That's roughly equivalent to 60 novels. The world map spans 136 square kilometers, each meter handcrafted rather than procedurally generated. But raw scale tells only part of the story. The real technical achievement was their Red Engine 3, built specifically for open-world streaming. Most open-world engines divide the world into cells that load and unload as you move. The challenge is making this invisible. Red Engine 3 pioneered what they called umbra occlusion culling, dynamically calculating what the player can't see and not rendering it, even in dense urban environments like Novigrad with its hundreds of NPCs, each running their own schedules. The engine could handle 2,000 NPCs existing simultaneously in memory, though only about 150 would be actively simulated at any moment. Their quest system deserves particular attention. They built a node-based quest editor that allowed writers to script complex branching narratives without programmer involvement. Each quest could have multiple entry points, conditional branches based on world state, and consequences that rippled across other quests. The Bloody Baron questline alone has 7 different major outcomes based on accumulated player choices, with 23 different conversation variations tracked through their dialogue database.
The Bloody Baron. That sequence where your choices about a domestic abuser slowly reveal themselves to have shaped an entire region's fate. No clear villains, no perfect outcomes.
That questline required 12 writers working for 6 months, plus dedicated level designers who rebuilt the Crow's Perch area 3 times to support all narrative permutations. The technical challenge was maintaining narrative coherence across so many variables. They developed what they called a fact database, essentially a massive state machine tracking every significant player choice. Quest designers could query this database. Has the player met Kara Metz? Did they give the witch hunters information? Is the Baron still alive? Each fact becomes a Boolean that can gate content, alter dialogue, or change NPC behavior. The combat system pushed different boundaries. They motion captured 200 hours of sword combat with professional stunt performers, then built a dynamic animation blending system that could combine these captures based on player input and enemy position. The result feels fluid because it's actually assembling animations in real time. Geralt's sword swing against a human enemy uses different motion data than against a griffin, with the engine interpolating between captures to match the exact spatial relationship. But perhaps most impressive was their approach to side content. In most open-world games, side quests are filler, fetch quests, combat challenges, collectibles. The Witcher 3 treated every quest as potentially meaningful. They had a rule: no quest without a story. Even a simple contract to kill a monster would have investigation phases, moral choices, unexpected twists. This required enormous writing resources, but also clever technical solutions. They built a modular conversation system where voice lines could be dynamically assembled based on context, reducing recording needs while maintaining variety.
And it worked. Players actually wanted to do side quests. Revolutionary concept, optional content that doesn't feel like homework, though I wonder about the human cost of such ambition.
The human cost was significant. CD Projekt Red became notorious for crunch culture. Developers reported 100-hour weeks leading up to launch. The game shipped with numerous bugs that required months of patches. The studio later acknowledged these issues, promising reform, though Cyberpunk 2077's troubled launch suggests systemic problems persist. This highlights a fundamental tension in AAA development. The Witcher 3's achievements, its narrative complexity, technical sophistication, sheer content density, required resources and human effort that push against sustainable development practices. When players praise the game's quest design or marvel at its seamless open world, they're experiencing the output of systems that demanded extraordinary sacrifice from their creators. The game's post-launch support model also established new AAA patterns. 2 major expansions, Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, added another 50 hours of content, with Blood and Wine essentially being a full game in itself. These weren't cynical cash grabs, but genuine artistic statements, winning awards typically reserved for full releases. The 16 free DLC packages, while sometimes cosmetic, built tremendous goodwill. CD Projekt Red had cracked a code: how to monetize additional content while maintaining player trust.
Trust that they'd systematically destroy with Cyberpunk's launch, but that's perhaps a lesson for another time. What strikes me about The Witcher 3 is how it became a reference point for the entire industry. Witcher 3 quality side quests became shorthand for meaningful optional content. Studios started hiring narrative designers specifically to ensure their open worlds had stories worth discovering. Ubisoft restructured their entire approach to Assassin's Creed after Witcher 3 exposed how formulaic their side content had become.
The influence went beyond design philosophy to technical implementation. The Witcher 3's approach to loading distant landscapes, using automated LOD generation with artist overrides for hero assets, became industry standard. Their dynamic weather system, which actually affected gameplay through reduced visibility and NPC behavior changes, pushed competitors to add similar features. Even their menu design, with its nested categorization and sorting options for hundreds of items, influenced inventory systems across the genre. Yet for all its achievements, The Witcher 3 also represented something potentially unsustainable: the AAA arms race, where each game must be bigger, more detailed, more technically advanced than the last. The question becomes, where does this escalation lead?
While CD Projekt Red was pursuing maximum narrative density and technical spectacle, From Software was quietly perfecting the opposite approach. Where The Witcher 3 said yes to everything, yes to quest markers, yes to difficulty options, yes to player convenience, From Software built an empire on saying no. The evolution from Demon's Souls in 2009 to Elden Ring in 2022 represents something peculiar in AAA development, a studio that found its formula and then spent 13 years refining rather than reinventing it. Each game is recognizably From Software, yet the technical and design evolution between them is profound. They've proven that innovation doesn't require abandoning your core principles, Sometimes it means doubling down on them until they achieve a kind of purity. Consider their approach to difficulty, where most AAA games offer granular difficulty sliders, enemy health, damage dealt, resource availability. From Software provides one option, the game as designed. This isn't mere stubbornness. Their entire design philosophy depends on shared experience. When you finally defeat Ornstein and Small, you know that everyone who reached that point faced the exact same challenge. The communal aspect of their games, the messages, the bloodstains, the shared strategies, only works because everyone is playing the same game.
Technically, they achieve this through extremely tight coupling between systems. Enemy placement, level geometry, player movement speed, attack animations, everything is calibrated around specific difficulty assumptions. Adding difficulty options would require redesigning essentially everything.
Which brings us to their remarkable efficiency. Dark Souls was made by a team of about 80 people. The Witcher 3 required 250. Elden Ring, their most ambitious project, peaked at around 300 developers, still modest by AAA standards. They achieved this through radical focus. No dialogue trees with thousands of branches, no procedural quest generation, no vast libraries of craftable items with percentage-based stat variations. Instead, they hand-place every enemy, handcraft every item, hand-tune every encounter. It's artisanal game development at AAA scale. Where other studios use procedural generation to fill their open worlds, From Software treats each location like a Swiss watch, every component precisely positioned to create specific player experiences. Their approach to storytelling is equally distinctive. Where Western RPGs spell out their narratives in codex entries and exposition dumps, From Software scatters fragments across item descriptions, environmental details, and cryptic NPC dialogue. Players must actively reconstruct the narrative, becoming archaeologists of fictional worlds. This isn't lazy writing, it's a conscious choice that transforms story from something you consume into something you construct.
The technical implementation supports this philosophy. Their engine prioritizes precise collision detection and frame-perfect animation timing over graphical fidelity. They'll sacrifice polygon count for consistent frame rates because missing an iframe due to stuttering breaks the entire experience.
And here's where it gets interesting for our broader discussion. From Software represents a third path between indie and AAA, what we might call the AAA indie hybrid. They have AAA budgets and publisher backing, but they operate with indie sensibilities. They make the games they want to make, accessibility be damned. They trust their audience to meet them halfway. This model is spreading. Larian Studios followed a similar path with Baldur's Gate 3, AAA production values applied to deeply systems-driven, uncompromising design. They spent 6 years in development, 3 in early access, ignoring industry trends about game length and complexity. The result? A 100-hour RPG with more branching narrative paths than a quantum physics textbook, built by a studio that refuses to use many standard AAA practices like excessive monetization or simplified mechanics. Remedy Entertainment offers another variation. With Control and Alan Wake 2, they're making AAA games that feel like arthouse films, weird, challenging, more interested in creating specific aesthetic experiences than maximizing market appeal. They've found publishers willing to fund their vision precisely because the AAA space has become so homogenized that weirdness itself becomes a selling point.
There's a technical component to this shift. Modern engines like Unreal Engine 5 have democratized AAA quality visuals. Small teams can achieve photorealistic graphics without building tech from scratch. This frees them to focus on design innovation rather than technical infrastructure.
Which suggests an interesting future for RPGs specifically. We're seeing a stratification of the market. At one end, you have the mega productions, your Witcher 4s and Elder Scrolls 6, that require thousands of developers and hundreds of millions in budget. At the other end, solo developers are creating deeply personal experiences with tools that would have seemed miraculous 20 years ago. But in the middle, we're seeing these hybrid studios that combine AAA polish with indie design sensibilities. They're proving that you don't need to chase every market trend or implement every feature on marketing's wish list. Sometimes, doing one thing extraordinarily well is more valuable than doing 20 things adequately. The question becomes, is this sustainable? Or are we witnessing a brief moment before market forces reassert themselves and everything collapses back into safe, focus-tested design?
Historical patterns suggest both outcomes are possible. The late 1990s saw similar experimentation before publishers consolidated and risk aversion set in. But current conditions, digital distribution, early access funding, streaming culture, create new possibilities for sustainable niches.
Perhaps what we're really seeing is the maturation of games as a medium. Film has blockbusters and art house, literature has airport novels and experimental fiction. Games are finally developing a similar ecosystem, different scales of production serving different audiences, all commercially viable in their own ways. The irony is that this diversity emerges just as technological barriers disappear. When anyone can make a beautiful game, beauty alone stops being enough. Design, vision, and authorial voice become the differentiators. We're entering an era where the question isn't, can we build this, but should we? And more importantly, why?
The next logical question becomes, what tools and engines are enabling this creative explosion? The democratization of game development technology fundamentally altered who can make games and how they approach the craft. The evolution of game engines tells the story of how we went from only programmers can make games to anyone with an idea can make games. It's a technical revolution that happened gradually, then suddenly, fundamentally altering who gets to participate in the medium. In the early days of RPG development, your Ultimas, your Wizardries, every studio essentially built their own engine from scratch. You'd write assembly code to draw sprites, manage memory, handle input. Even basic functionality like displaying text required custom solutions. This created an enormous barrier to entry. You needed deep technical knowledge just to get a pixel on screen, let alone create complex RPG systems. The first crack in this wall came with tools like Adventure Game Studio in 1997 and RPG Maker 95. These weren't general-purpose engines, but specialized tools for specific genres. RPG Maker in particular deserves attention. It abstracted away the technical complexity of JRPG development, tile-based maps, turn-based combat, menu systems, into visual editors. Suddenly, creating an RPG required understanding design principles, not programming languages.
RPG Maker had this fascinating cultural impact beyond democratization. It became a creative outlet for people who would never have considered themselves game developers.
The technical achievement was significant. They solved the hardest problems of JRPG creation, sprite management, collision detection, save systems, combat flow, and wrapped them in an interface a teenager could understand. The scripting system used simplified event commands instead of traditional code. Want an NPC to move? Select Move Route from a drop-down. Want a battle? Pick Enemy Encounter and configure the parameters. But here's what's crucial. They made opinionated choices. RPG Maker games look like RPG Maker games. The battle system works one specific way. Maps use specific tile sizes. These constraints were features, not bugs. By removing infinite possibilities, they made creation achievable. The 2000s saw the emergence of more flexible tools. Game Maker, initially released in 1999, offered a middle ground. It had visual scripting for beginners, but also supported a full programming language, GML, for advanced users. This gradient of complexity proved powerful. You could start with drag-and-drop logic and gradually learn programming as your ambitions grew. Mark Overmars, Game Maker's creator, understood something fundamental. The jump from no programming to programming was too large for most people. Game Maker provided stepping stones. You'd start by dragging pre-made actions, then modify some parameters, then write simple scripts, and eventually develop complex systems. Each step felt achievable.
This pedagogical approach to tool design, teaching through doing rather than studying, seems particularly important for creative fields.
Absolutely, and it paid off spectacularly. Spelunky started as a Game Maker project. Undertale, as we discussed, was built entirely in Game Maker Studio. Hyperlight Drifter, Nuclear Throne, Katana Zero, all Game Maker games that competed directly with AAA productions. The technical evolution of Game Maker itself mirrors the democratization process. Early versions exported Windows-only executables. GameMaker Studio added Mac and Linux. Studio 2 brought console exports. Suddenly, indie developers could publish on PlayStation and Nintendo Switch without rewriting their entire game. The barrier between hobby project and commercial release essentially disappeared. Meanwhile, the AAA space was experiencing its own transformation. Unity launched in 2005 with a radical proposition, a featured 3D engine accessible to small teams. Previous 3D engines, Unreal, CryEngine, id Tech, required massive licensing fees and were designed for large studios. Unity targeted the opposite market. Their motto was democratize game development. The technical architecture reflected this philosophy. Component-based design meant you could attach behaviors to objects without understanding the underlying systems. Want physics? Add a rigid body component. Want to render a model? Add a mesh renderer. This modularity made complex 3D development approachable. Unity's Asset Store, launched in 2010, accelerated this democratization. Can't model characters? Buy them. Need a dialogue system? Purchase one for $50 instead of programming for months. The Asset Store turned game development into assembly rather than pure creation. Some saw this as cheapening the medium. I see it as enabling focus. Why spend 6 months on an inventory system when you could spend that time on what makes your game unique?
There's an interesting parallel to the evolution of filmmaking, from hand-cranked cameras and home-developed film to digital cameras and editing software. Democratization of tools doesn't diminish the art. It reveals how many potential artists were excluded by technical barriers.
Unreal Engine's trajectory offers a different model. Originally created for Unreal in 1998, it was the opposite of approachable, a powerful but complex tool for technical teams. Epic Games made a strategic decision around 2012 to pivot toward accessibility. Unreal Engine 4 introduced blueprint visual scripting. Suddenly, designers could create complex gameplay without writing C++. The real disruption came with their pricing model. In 2015, they made Unreal Engine free with a 5% royalty on commercial products after the first $3,000 per quarter. This meant students, hobbyists, and indie developers could access the same tools used for Gears of War and Fortnite. No upfront costs, no barriers to experimentation. Unreal Engine 5, released in 2021, pushed this further. Technologies like Nanite virtualized geometry and Lumen global illumination made photorealistic graphics achievable without specialized technical knowledge. The engine handles optimization automatically. Artists can import film-quality assets, and the engine figures out how to render them efficiently. It's sufficiently advanced technology indistinguishable from magic. But here's the crucial point. Tool evolution isn't merely about lowering barriers. It's about expanding possibility spaces. Modern engines enable different kinds of games. Unity's 2D tools and physics systems made possible the entire physics puzzle platformer genre. Unreal's networking architecture enabled the battle royale phenomenon. Tools shape what gets created.
Marshall McLuhan would have loved this. The medium is the message, but in game development, the tools are the medium. The engine you choose fundamentally shapes what you can express.
Consider version control as another democratizing force. Early game development used folder copying, Project Final V2 backup, prone to catastrophic data loss. Perforce required expensive licenses and server infrastructure. Then Git arrived, free and distributed. GitHub made it accessible to non-programmers. Suddenly, small teams could collaborate professionally. You could experiment without fear, knowing you could roll back changes. The same pattern appears everywhere. Art creation, from Photoshop's $600 license to Krita, free and open source. Audio, from Pro Tools hardware requirements to Reaper's $60 license. 3D modeling, from 3ds Max's annual subscriptions to Blender, completely free yet industry competitive. Each tool that becomes accessible removes another gate. By 2024, the entire game development pipeline is available for free. Godot provides a fully open source engine. Blender handles 3D modeling and animation. Krita for 2D art, Ardor for audio, Git for version control, VS Code for programming. You can create commercial quality games with zero upfront investment beyond a computer.
Which brings us to an interesting paradox. When everyone can make games, how do you stand out? When technical barriers vanish, what becomes the differentiator?
Design, voice, polish. The same things that always mattered, but were previously overshadowed by technical hurdles. We're seeing a shift from "can you program" to "do you have something interesting to say?" This democratization extends beyond tools to knowledge. YouTube tutorials teach advanced techniques for free. Discord communities provide instant help. Game jams offer practice and feedback. The entire support structure for learning game development emerged alongside the tools. You don't need a computer science degree or industry connections. You need patience and dedication. The impact on RPGs specifically has been profound. Creating an RPG used to require solving numerous technical challenges: save systems, inventory management, dialogue trees, combat mechanics. Now, these are solved problems. Unity's Asset Store has dozens of RPG frameworks. Godot includes RPG tutorials. RPG Maker remains actively developed, each version more capable. This frees developers to focus on what makes their RPG unique. Disco Elysium could concentrate on revolutionary dialogue systems because they didn't waste time programming basic inventory management. Hades could iterate on narrative integration because the engine handled performance optimization. When infrastructure becomes invisible, creativity flourishes.
We've traced the arc from "only programmers can make games" to "anyone can make games." But what happens when players themselves become creators? When the line between consumption and creation blurs entirely?
That's already happening. Dreams on PlayStation turns players into developers. Roblox and Minecraft blur the boundary between playing and making. Modding tools become increasingly sophisticated. We're approaching a future where game creation itself becomes a form of play. The democratization of tools was just the first step. The democratization of creation is next.
There's a peculiar alchemy that occurs when players decide to master a game so thoroughly that they transform it into something its creators never imagined. Speedrunning represents perhaps the purest distillation of this transformation, a practice where the game becomes a canvas for virtuosity. The origins trace back to Doom in 1993. ID Software included a simple feature: the ability to record and share gameplay demos. They couldn't have anticipated that this modest addition would spawn an entire subculture. Players began competing for fastest completion times, sharing .lmp files through bulletin boards and early internet forums. But here's what's fascinating. This was more than bragging rights. It was about collective knowledge building, a distributed research project into the deepest mechanics of virtual worlds. What emerged was something unprecedented in gaming history: communities dedicated not to playing games as intended, but to breaking them in precisely controlled ways. The 1997 Quake Done Quick demo showed the world what this looked like. Players chaining together rocket jumps, bunny hops, and sequence breaks to complete the game in under 20 minutes. Watching it felt like witnessing a magic trick where you knew the method, but still couldn't believe the execution. This wasn't merely technical prowess. It was a new form of play that inverted the traditional relationship between player and designer. Where most players follow the path laid out for them, speedrunners ask, what happens if I refuse the intended experience? What lies in the spaces between what you meant to build?
The technical discoveries these communities make are remarkable. They essentially reverse engineer games without access to source code.
Consider what happened with Ocarina of Time. Nintendo crafted a 20-hour epic, carefully gated progression through dungeons and items. Speedrunners discovered wrong warps, memory manipulation, arbitrary code execution. They turned Link's adventure into a 17-minute sprint from Kokiri Forest to Ganon's defeat. Each glitch required frame-perfect inputs, deep understanding of how the game stores data, how it transitions between scenes. The wrong warp glitch alone, where players exploit how the game loads actors when transitioning areas, required mapping hundreds of memory states. Someone had to discover that entering a specific door while holding a specific item after performing specific actions would teleport you to the credits. This isn't random button mashing. It's methodical deconstruction of virtual reality itself. But the real revolution came with streaming. Speed Demo's archive formalized record-keeping in the 2000s, but Twitch transformed speedrunning from niche hobby to performance art. Suddenly, the process became as important as the product. Viewers could watch runners attempt the same trick hundreds of times, feel the tension of a run on world record pace, experience the heartbreak of a mistake 20 minutes into a perfect attempt. Games done quick crystallize this into something remarkable: speedrunning as charity theatre. Started in 2010 with a basement and a dream, by 2024 it raises millions per event. The appeal transcends gaming. Watching someone perform a blindfolded punch-out run or complete Dark Souls using voice commands alone, these are feats of human achievement that happen to use games as their medium.
Developers started acknowledging speedrunners explicitly. Celeste added timers, death counters. Some intentionally include sequence breaks.
The relationship between developers and speedrunners evolved into something beautifully symbiotic. Initially, many developers viewed glitch exploitation as embarrassing, evidence of sloppy programming, but gradually they recognized speedrunning as the ultimate compliment. These players loved their games enough to spend thousands of hours finding new ways to experience them. Some developers lean into it completely. The Metroid series traditionally rewards fast completion with better endings. Axiom Verge includes a speedrun mode. Hades tracks your best times. But more interesting are the developers who design with speedrunners in mind without announcing it, leaving in useful glitches, creating movement mechanics that reward mastery, building levels with hidden shortcuts for those willing to experiment. Yet, the most profound impact might be how speedrunning changed our understanding of what games can be. Traditional criticism focuses on narrative, mechanics, aesthetics, the intended experience. Speedrunning reveals games as possibility spaces far richer than their creators imagined. Every game contains infinite games within it, waiting for players creative enough to find them. Take Super Mario 64, perhaps the most studied game in speedrunning history. 28 years after release, runners still discover new techniques. The carpetless strategy, found in 2019, saves seconds in a game where the any % record stands under 7 minutes. Think about that. Decades of collective effort to shave fractions of seconds, and still the game yields secrets.
The technical documentation speedrunners produce rivals academic research, frame data, RNG manipulation guides, memory maps.
They've become accidental archivists, preserving not just games but the deepest possible understanding of how they function. When the original developers of decades-old games have forgotten implementation details, speedrun communities maintain that knowledge. They're preserving history at a granular level museums can't match. And this preservation matters beyond nostalgia. Modern developers study speedrun techniques to understand emergent gameplay, to see how players push systems to breaking points. The movement mechanics that feel best, your Celeste dash, your Titanfall wall run, often descend from glitches speedrunners discovered in earlier games. Rocket jumping started as a Quake exploit. Now it's a designed feature in dozens of games. The cultural impact extends further still. Speedrunning proved could be spectator sports without traditional competition. It demonstrated that mastery itself, the pursuit of perfection, could captivate audiences. It showed that games decades old could find new relevance, new communities, new life. Most importantly, speedrunning embodies gaming's unique quality among art forms. The audience can always dig deeper than the artist intended. You can't speedrun a movie or sequence break a novel, but games, by their interactive nature, invite players to push boundaries, to ask, what if? And have the medium answer back.
It fundamentally changed how we think about bugs, glitches, and unintended behavior.
In speedrunning, a glitch isn't a flaw, it's an opportunity. A crash isn't failure, it's evidence you're pushing boundaries. This mentality, this transformation of imperfection into art, might be speedrunning's greatest contribution to gaming culture. It taught us that the most interesting experiences often lie not in what developers intended, but in the spaces between intention and implementation, in the gaps where player creativity meets systemic possibility.
The gap between intention and implementation that speedrunners exploit exists in movement mechanics and narrative systems. We've discussed many games throughout this journey: Chrono Trigger's multiple endings, Undertale's route system, The Witcher's branching quests. But let's examine the technical architecture that makes these branching stories possible. At its core, A branching narrative is a state machine. Every choice updates variables. Every variable influences future options. Simple concept, complex execution. Early RPGs like Wizardry tracked maybe a dozen flags: quest completion, party alignment, NPC survival. Modern titles track thousands. The Witcher 3 maintains over 950 quest states, with dependencies cascading across its 450,000-word script. The technical challenge goes beyond storage. Maintaining coherence is the real hurdle. When you have 36 possible world states entering a scene, how do you write dialogue that acknowledges the player's specific journey without creating 36 separate scripts? This is where narrative systems engineering becomes crucial.
The artistry lies in making those branches feel meaningful rather than mechanical. A player shouldn't sense the database beneath the drama.
Precisely. BioWare pioneered what they called the spoken hub model in Knights of the Old Republic. Major story beats converge at specific points, the hub, while player choices create variations, the spokes, that flavor how you reach and experience those moments. You might arrive at the same climactic battle, but as a hero or villain with different allies facing different emotional stakes. This design pattern scales efficiently. Instead of exponential branching, where every choice doubles your content needs, you create controlled divergence and convergence. Technical necessity birthing narrative rhythm.
Yet some of the most affecting narrative choices aren't about grand divergence at all. Papers, please. Your choices are bureaucratic stamps, but they carry moral weight that ripples through your family's survival.
Papers, Please demonstrates another evolution: procedural narrative generation. Lucas Pope didn't script every possible combination of choices. He built systems, immigration rules, family needs, terrorist plots, that interact to create emergent stories. The narrative engine becomes a simulation rather than a flowchart. This approach reached new heights with Dwarf Fortress, which generates entire civilizations with millennia of history. Every artifact has a creator. Every war has causes. Every noble has grudges. The game literally writes books, in-game texts with procedurally generated poetry about generated historical events. It's narrative systems as world simulation. But even sophisticated procedural systems hit limits. No algorithm captures human nuance in character dialogue or emotional beats. This is why modern games often hybrid approaches, systemic mechanics with handcrafted moments.
The tension between authored and emergent narrative haunts the medium. The authored gives us Aerith's death, singular, crafted, unforgettable. The emergent gives us that time your RimWorld colonist went berserk because their rival ate without a table. Absurd, personal, unrepeatable. Both valid, both valuable, yet seemingly incompatible. Or are they?
Increasingly, they're not. Modern narrative systems layer these approaches. Take Hades. Supergiant Games built a database of contextual dialogue. Thousands of lines acknowledge your deaths, your weapon choices, your relationship progress. The core story arc remains authored, but the texture constantly shifts based on systemic tracking. They solved a fundamental problem: repetition. In a game about dying repeatedly, how do you maintain narrative momentum? Their solution was granular reactivity. Characters comment on your 20th death differently than your second. They notice if you're struggling with specific bosses, experimenting with new weapons, pursuing romance subplots. The technical implementation required what they called narrative Lego blocks, modular dialogue snippets with complex prerequisite chains, each line tagged with conditions. Has player died to Mega Era 5 times? Is relationship level with Thanatos above threshold? Did player just escape with Aegis shield?
And this reactivity creates the illusion, no, the reality, of a living world that sees you, acknowledges your specific journey. When Achilles comments on your 100th escape attempt, you feel seen by the game itself. The systematic becomes personal through sheer density of acknowledgement.
The data structure innovations enable this density. Early branching narratives used simple binary flags. Modern systems employ more sophisticated approaches. Disco Elysium tracks not just choices but the reasoning behind them through its thought cabinet system. Your character's internal ideological development becomes mechanically meaningful. They implemented what amounts to a personality state machine. Not just did you punch the fascist, but what ideological framework justified that punch. The game tracks your emerging political philosophy, subconscious fears, conceptual breakthroughs. These flags are like multidimensional psychological profiles that influence available dialogue options.
Which brings us to the most ambitious question in narrative design. Can games truly model human conversation? Every dialogue tree, no matter how complex, eventually reveals its artifice. You exhaust the options, see the seams, feel the database beneath. Yet developers keep pushing toward the grail of natural dialogue, where talking to characters feels as organic as talking to people. An impossible dream?
Current technical approaches suggest it's more achievable than ever. Natural language processing, while not perfect, has reached a point where games can parse player text input meaningfully. Facade attempted this in 2005. Type anything to the arguing couple, watch them respond. Primitive by today's standards, but it pointed toward possibilities. The challenge is twofold. Developers need to understand player input and also generate responses that keep the narrative coherent. You can't let players derail carefully crafted story arcs, yet you want them to feel heard. This is where large language models enter the picture, though their integration remains experimental. More immediately practical are systems like Wildermyth's procedural character development. In this approach, characters form relationships, develop rivalries, and undergo transformations as a result of combat encounters and player choices. The game generates narrative vignettes to contextualize these mechanical changes. For example, your archer might overcome a fear of heights after a harrowing mountain battle, rather than simply receiving a stat boost.
The philosophical question lurking beneath all these technical innovations: what story are we actually telling? The designer's story, the player's story, the story that emerges from their collision. Games unique among media can tell all three simultaneously, but the balance shifts with each advancement in narrative systems. When we perfect procedural dialogue, when every choice seamlessly branches, when characters feel truly alive, have we created the ultimate storytelling medium, or dissolved authorship entirely into systematic possibility?
Perhaps that dissolution is the point. When speedrunners find unintended paths through games, they're writing new stories. When narrative systems enable unprecedented player expression, they're not destroying authorial intent, they're fulfilling gaming's deepest promise. The medium has always been about possibility spaces. Narrative systems extend that principle from geography to story itself. The future likely holds even more radical experiments. AI-driven NPCs that genuinely remember and evolve. Narrative systems that learn player preferences and adjust tone accordingly. Stories that branch not merely based on choices, but on play style, emotional state, time invested. We're building towards something unprecedented in human history. Stories that truly listen, adapt, respond. Not choose your own adventures, but collaborate on your adventure. The technical foundations exist. The question now is what stories we'll tell with these tools.
And perhaps more importantly, what stories these tools will tell through us. When the systems become sophisticated enough, who's the author and who's the audience? In the gap between those roles lies the future of interactive narrative. So here we are, having traced this extraordinary arc from mainframe experiments to collaborative narrative systems. What strikes me most profoundly isn't any single innovation, but the pattern itself, how each breakthrough emerges from the collision of technical constraint and human creativity. Consider the journey we've chronicled. In 1975, someone looked at a PDP-10's text terminal and imagined dungeon corridors. By 1986, Dragon Quest transformed that vision into something a child could play on their television. Each step demanded a philosophical leap as much as a technical one. What if computers could tell stories? What if those stories could respond to us? What if the audience could become co-authors? The technical innovations alone would fill volumes, battery-backed saves enabling persistent worlds, Mode 7 creating the illusion of vast landscapes from clever tricks, memory mappers squeezing symphonies into kilobytes, network code transforming solitary quests into shared adventures. But technology was always the servant, never the master. The real innovation was recognizing that interactivity could create experiences impossible in any other medium.
The pattern repeats at every scale, too. Iwata compressing EarthBound's dialogue, Fox hacking save files for meta-narrative effect, indie developers turning engine limitations into stylistic choices.
Exactly. And that brings us to perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this history, how failure and success intertwine so completely that they become indistinguishable. EarthBound, a commercial disaster that inspired a generation. Final Fantasy, saved from being Squaresoft's swan song to become their defining legacy. Cave Story, created in obscurity for 5 years before demonstrating solo development's viability. Each failure planted seeds that bloomed years later. The fan translation communities preserving failed games created the infrastructure for modern indie localization. The modding scenes around Morrowind and Neverwinter Nights trained the developers now leading major studios. Even technical dead ends, FMV adventures, motion control experiments, taught lessons that informed later successes. But perhaps most significantly, RPGs pioneered gaming as a cultural force. Entertainment and community. Product and conversation. When someone mentions Aerith's death or Undertale's pacifist rote, they're invoking shared experiences that transcend the games themselves. These software packages are also cultural texts, as rich and referential as any literary canon.
The speedrunning phenomenon you explored earlier exemplifies this perfectly. Games becoming performance art, archaeological sites, collaborative puzzles that communities solve for decades.
Yes, and that community aspect reveals something fundamental about the medium. RPGs taught us that games could be more than competitions or reflexes. They could be journeys we take together, even when playing alone. Every forum post dissecting Chrono Trigger's time travel mechanics, every piece of Deltarune fan art, every heated debate about Fallout's correct endings. These aren't auxiliary to the experience. They are the experience, extended beyond the screen into culture itself. The technical democratization we've witnessed, from $100,000 development kits to free engines anyone can download, has changed the landscape entirely. Now, Toby Fox can create Undertale in his apartment, ConcernedApe can spend 4 years perfecting Stardew Valley alone, and ZAUM can emerge from nowhere with Disco Elysium's literary ambitions. The medium's vocabulary is expanding exponentially. Each era brought its own innovations. The 8-bit era proved games could tell stories. The 16-bit era showed those stories could make us cry. The 3D transition demonstrated worlds could feel real. The online age revealed those worlds could be shared. The indie revolution confirmed that one person's vision could matter as much as any corporation's budget. And now, with narrative AI and procedural generation, we're approaching stories that might never tell themselves the same way twice.
Looking forward, the technical possibilities seem almost overwhelming. Real-time ray tracing could make indie games visually indistinguishable from AAA titles. AI may enable responsive NPCs with genuine personality. Procedural generation is advancing to the point where it can create entire cultures, not just dungeons.
Yet I suspect the future's most profound innovations won't be technical at all. They'll be conceptual, philosophical even. We've seen it throughout this history. The biggest leaps came not from better processors, but from asking better questions. What if the player could spare the monsters? What if choices had consequences across generations? What if failure was more interesting than success? The questions awaiting us are even more intriguing. What if games could adapt to our emotional states? What if stories evolved based on community behavior? What if the boundary between player and designer dissolved entirely? These aren't technical challenges anymore. The technology largely exists. They're creative challenges, philosophical challenges, human challenges. And that, ultimately, is the RPG genre's greatest gift to gaming, and perhaps to culture itself. It proved that interactivity wasn't a limitation, but a new dimension of human expression. Every choice, every branching path, every customized character represents a small act of co-creation between designer and player. Multiply that by millions of players over decades, and you have something unprecedented in human history. Stories that exist not as fixed texts, but as possibility spaces, explored differently by each person who enters them.
The technical journey from text parsers to neural networks, from 2 KB of RAM to photorealistic open worlds, it's staggering. But you're right, the real achievement is what we've done with those tools.
Indeed. We've created worlds where shy kids can be heroes, where curiosity is rewarded, where patience and kindness matter as much as reflexes. We've built spaces for grief, joy, humor, horror, the full spectrum of human experience made interactive. We've proven that games aren't lesser than other media, but different, capable of things no other form can achieve. From Colossal Cave to whatever impossibility someone is coding right now, the journey continues. The dungeons grow deeper, the choices more nuanced, the worlds more responsive. But the heart remains constant, that fundamental RPG promise. You can be more than you are. You can grow, change, affect the world around you. In Pixels and Code, we've found a mirror for the human experience itself. That's the legacy worth celebrating. The technical innovations are remarkable. The cultural impact has been profound. Most importantly, there's the simple, radical idea that stories can listen, worlds can respond, and players can matter. In that space between designer's intent and player's action, magic happens. It happened in 1975. It happens today. And as long as there are dreamers with keyboards and ideas bigger than their budgets, it will keep happening. The adventure, as they say, continues.